data and adaptive machine learning approach.
Thank you very much to putting the paper on the program. This is joint work with Catherine Chen, Chen Gao, Jonathan Hazel, and Li Hua Lei, who are mostly here. So, of course, it's well known that inflation is very difficult to forecast. So the traditional approach often uses macroeconomic data. But inflation reflects millions of micro price decisions. So a very natural question is, can you use micro data to help to forecast inflation? This also connects to kind of a recent key macroeconomic questions, which is, does micro heterogeneity matter for macro dynamics? So the key challenge is a non-stationarity in inflation dynamics. So for example, the inflation dynamics before and after the pandemic is quite different. Also on the theory side, maybe also microdata predicts aggregate inflation only for certain shocks, maybe when shocks are large or granular. So this means that the traditional forecasting approach, which often focuses on average forecasting performance, may not be best suited to harness the forecasting power of microdata. So in this paper, what we try to do is we try to provide an approach to forecast inflation with high-dimensional microdata, but together with an adaptive machine learning approach that's designed to harness the occasional predicting power of the microdata. So before using the microdata for forecasting, so we will first to answer a very basic question, which is, does microdata improve forecast at least for certain periods and horizons? And because the standard forecast comparison tests often focus on average forecast over the full sample, such as Debo and Mariano, so we develop a scan test, which is designed to test occasional forecast outperformance with non-stationarity. And we will see later on it's indeed the case that microdata has occasional forecasting outperformance over standard tests like seasonally adjusted ARIMA. Then we develop an adaptive machine learning pipeline to harness the occasional forecasting power of microdata. So we will first encode the distribution of the price changes into a high-dimensional vector. So in particular, we're going to use the underlying microdata behind the UK CPI. And you may wonder, why don't we just directly put in the underlying microdata in? There's too much noise, and the length of the data is not fixed. It's not designed. It's not a good input for the machine learning algorithm we will use. So we'll start encoding, which still basically keep it high dimensional, but make the input suitable for the machine learning algorithm. Then we're going to make a microdata-based forecast with gradient boosting tree, and it's crucial to tune the hyperparameters in real time to avoid look-ahead bias. And finally, we're going to combine microdata with other standard benchmarks that's used by the central bank, for example, the standard univariate seasonally adjusted ARIMA via adaptive machine learning algorithm, in particular the fixed share algorithm. So the intuition of the algorithm is basically they change the weights across different forecasts adaptively. So you give high weights on the micro forecast only when it performs well recently. So in this case, it can adaptively choose what's the best forecast recently, and this is useful to handle a non-stationary environment. And in terms of the results, we have four key empirical results. First is micro forecast outperforms the benchmark, for example, the univariate forecast, but only after 2020 when inflation is high and volatile, and mainly at longer horizons. In fact, before the 2020, the micro data-based forecast is much worse than the standard seasonally adjusted ARIMA. And then the second is the micro forecast indeed passed the scan test, and so it does have occasional, forecast outperformance and should be included in the adaptive combined forecast. And third is the combined forecast, which is basically a weighted average of the standard benchmark forecast and the micro forecast, but change the weights adaptively. It matches the benchmark performance before 2020. So no longer the case is worse than the seasonally adjusted ARIMA before 2020. It kind of avoids kind of the shortcoming of the micro data alone based forecast, but outperforms the benchmark after 2020. And the fourth is the value of the microdata is time varying, and materializes after 2020. So one of the kind of advantage of this fixed share online learning algorithm is that you can just see the weights of different forecasts, and it can tell you basically how important the microdata is through the time varying weights, and you can see the weights going up quite a lot after 2020, and then you can so you can see the value of microdata materializes after 2020. So the algorithm puts more weights on the microdata during the high and volatile inflation. And finally, a criticism of those type of machine learning algorithm in macroeconomics is often it's pretty black boxy. So then finally we develop kind of a group sharply value approach to study which underlying feature of the microdata matter more. So in particular, consistent with some state-dependent pricing model with large shocks, we find that the price change decils are the most important features of the microdata in terms of help the forecasting power. So I'll start with a quick overview of the data. So the objective we will try to forecast is forecast the UK monthly headline CPI inflation using data spanning from 1996 to 2024. That's when basically the micro data starts to become available. So we'll use micro data on prices, which is millions of price quotes underlying UK CPI. The unit of observation is going to be item, shop, region, and month level, such as a loaf of bread at Sainsbury next to LSE in January 2024. So we're going to study item level monthly price growth. And in our baseline, we just don't want to kind of do a lot of artificial filtering. So we include the sales, but we also do a version excluding sales. And we also do a version use Nakamura, Stanson sales filters. And the results doesn't change that much no matter how we handle the sales. And for comparison, we also compare this with the macro-based forecast in which we're going to use the macro data. So in particular, we're going to have 36 monthly macro predictors in total, such as rents, commodity futures, supply chain prices, and labor market variables. So in particular, we're careful on two things. One is we use initial vintage because we don't want to kind of use the later vintage, which can introduce look-ahead bias. And we also the variables are not seasonally adjusted because sometimes the two-sided seasonal adjusted filter it can also introduce look-ahead bias. So to avoid that, so in our baseline analysis, the variables are not seasonally adjusted. So now let me introduce our methods. So the first step of our methods is to design a scan test, which tries to answer the question, does microdata outperform benchmark inflation forecast at least at certain times or certain horizons? For example, if it doesn't pass the scan test, then you should not use the microdata to forecast inflation to start with. And this is relevant because in theory, later on we're going to mention briefly, it's kind of only microdata only matters sometimes. If microdata, if the aggregate shock is small and you do a first order approximation with respect to aggregate shocks, then microdata shouldn't matter for forecasts. And so also in practice, you would also only want to include microdata in the adaptive combined forecast if it's at least occasionally useful. If it's not useful at any time, adding it is just adding it into the adaptive forecast is just adding noise and it hurts the performance. So because of these reasons, we would like to first start to design a scan test. So in particular, the scan test is designed to detect the occasional forecasting outperformance. So different from some standard tests in the literature, which is focusing on kind of average forecasting performance over the entire sample. So in particular, the scan test focuses on the difference in the forecast loss between a benchmark model B and a micro model M. So it can be used for all the type of model, but here just to give the intuition. So we use a scan test for a benchmark model. You can just think about the univariate seasonally adjusted ARIMA and a micro-based model, which is model M. And now we focus on the forecast loss differential D. So this is for a given horizon h, the forecast loss differential is basically the forecast loss of the benchmark model is the magnitude, the absolute value of the forecast error of the benchmark model minus the forecast error, its absolute value of the micro-based forecast. So if the benchmark model is doing well, then it has a lower forecast error. So this forecast loss differential is negative. If the micro-based forecast is doing well, then they have a smaller forecast error, then this forecast loss differential is positive. So the null hypothesis is that the benchmark model is at least as good as the micro forecast across all periods and horizons. So that's why basically it's kind of its expected value of this forecast loss differential is negative for all periods and all horizons. And the alternative hypothesis is that there is some sub-periods and horizon for which micro forecast outperforms benchmark. And in particular, we require these sub-periods to be continuous with a minimum length T mean, which in practice is going to be set between 6 to 12 months, because if it's just one period or 1 month, that could just be noise. So basically, it's a kind of a continuum of at least a T mean sub-periods. And so this is kind of basically we would like to basically try to test whether the microdata has additional forecasting power at any unknown subsample or horizon.
Sorry, quick question. Was that sample known ex ante or exposed? Because you can imagine doing either, right? So you could have a statement that, here now, we can tell that, back in 2022, your microdata did better than, led to a more accurate inflation forecast than the benchmark. Or you could, have a test that says, well, back in 2022, you could have predicted that your model was going to perform better than the benchmark. So in other words, is that interval known ahead of time?
So this is kind of the unknown intervals. In particular, we're gonna scan the potential intervals. So the interval is unknown at the time of making the test.
Okay, so it's an exposed thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask also a question? Why would you do it across all horizons and not separately for each horizon?
So we could do this for each particular horizon. So in fact, this is kind of then it's basically you just set this horizon to a specific horizon, and you can still apply the test.
I know you can do it, but why don't you do it that way?
So because I think it's kind of its ex ante is kind of somewhat unclear to us, like whether at least when we start to do this, it's kind of we don't have really a prior about whether the microdata helps for short or long horizons. But later on, you will see actually basically the results going to be before pandemic. It doesn't help for any horizon effectively, but post-pandemic, it helps for the vast majority of the horizons. So okay, so here is the statistics. So we will start to define a statistics for a given horizon and a given interval. So this is a TIH. And recall that we focus on the forecast loss differential, and if the benchmark model is doing good and it's negative, if the micro model is doing good and it's positive. So this statistics TIH is a cumulative forecast loss differential, and it's normalized both by the interval and by the local variability, and it's partially studentized. Instead of fully studentized, the full studentization is gamma equal to half, and the reason of this partial studentization is to deal with the fact that there is only around 6 to 12 observations per interval, and we will explain this a little bit more later. And then, so after this statistics TIH for a given interval and horizon, and then we construct this scan statistics Tmax, which identifies the subsample and the horizon with the strongest outperformance of the microdata. And then the scan test asks whether the Tmax, the scan statistics, is unusually large under the null hypothesis. So the null distribution of the scan statistics is non-standard and allows for the heteroscedasticity and non-stationarity. And it's also a high-dimensional comparison across 34,000 interval horizon pairs. So thanks to our econometrics co-author Li Hua, who is here, so we were able to develop some econometrics results For example, we approximate the null distribution with a Gaussian bootstrap, which is computationally efficient to deal with a comparison, a high-dimensional comparison. And then we have a result that the bootstrap going to be able to control the false positives despite the high-dimensional search. And to develop these results, we will need to use the techniques in the high-dimensional Gaussian approximation. So we don't have time to explain this in detail during the talk, but it's in the paper, and I'm sure Lihua is happy to explain more during the break. And also here we have a partial studentization to limit short interval over rejection. So when we work on this, we realize kind of so one thing that's kind of challenging is there are only 6 to 12 observations per interval. So we need to be fairly careful to avoid this, to avoid over rejection. So we select gamma via a null simulation calibrated to the observed loss differential and to avoid basically the over rejection because of the fact that there are only around 10 observations per interval. So now we're going to introduce the machine learning pipeline, as you will see later on. So we do find the microdata will be useful to help you forecast inflation, but not all the time, only occasionally. So then the question is, can you have like a machine learning pipeline to harness the occasional forecast power of the microdata? So the first step is we're going to encode the raw distribution of the price changes into still a high dimensional vector, but suitable for as input for the machine learning algorithm. And then the second step is we're going to use gradient boosting trees. So we do find that's the best algorithm for this setting together with this high dimensional vector to form a micro forecast. And it's also crucial to tune this in real time to avoid look-ahead bias. We actually tried quite hard to avoid, and it's actually pretty difficult to avoid. But so this is quite important for this pipeline. And finally, we have this adaptive part, which is combine the microdata with other standard benchmark forecasts used by the central bank. And the idea is basically you have the forecast is a weighted average across a few different forecasts, and you change the weights adaptively. If the microdata is doing well recently, you increase its weights. And here's where the scan test comes in. So one should only include any forecast, for example, micro forecast in the combined forecast, if it's occasionally useful via the scan test. If it doesn't really pass the scan test, it doesn't seem to be at least occasionally useful, you should not include it in the combined forecast, because in that case, it's just adding noise. So now let's talk about our pipeline. So our first step is to encode the micro price level data. So we'll use millions of individual price observations to forecast inflation. So one challenge is that the machine learning algorithm, at least we're going to use, is better suited for fixed length inputs, but products, of course, enter and exit. So for example, the Sainsbury's nears LSE may stop selling the loaf of bread. So we will need to do some basically encoding at the beginning to create stable high-dimensional vectors of monthly price change distribution. So inspired by the standard kind of manual cost model, we have a baseline price change encoding that's based on the fraction of 0 price changes for each product category, the mean of the non-zero price change, and 9 decils of non-zero price changes in each Corps 1 categories. And we have 12 legs. And so in our baseline implementation, we have CPI weighted, but we also tried an unweighted version. It doesn't matter that much. And we also have month indicators for seasonality, because seasonal adjustment is fairly important. So you should be building into the pipeline in a way that do not introduce look-ahead bias. And so we do this at a fairly broad category level, like a Corps 1, like food and clothing, to avoid noisy item level inputs. So basically, this type of encoding, together with the machine learning algorithm, makes forecasting with a distributional object feasible. And you may wonder, okay, so it seems that you could actually go deeper. You could have more granular categories. Maybe you should have more moments. Why don't we have more micro moments? So this is because if you have even richer micro encodings, it does have overfit risk. So for example, the performance, the forecast performance in terms of mean absolute value depends on two components, the approximation error and the estimation error. And do note that we are in an environment in which the monthly inflation sample is short relative to product level variation. So estimation error can grow in the number of predictors due to overfitting. So for example, we try the richer encodings. For example, you can add more moments or you can add more granular product categories. So the results are basically similar as the baseline, but just slightly worse. So this is consistent with when you try to add in more, you're going to introduce more estimation error. So after the encoding, we're going to introduce our machine learning-based micro forecast.
But so, like, should we be worried then that what you just described feels a little like data mining?
Mm-hmm.
That you kind of searched over a bunch of possible specifications, and like you're showing us, it sounds like kind of the best one. And so then the question would be like, if you were trying to do this in real time, how do we know? Like, is the claim just that kind of we searched over these things, and we think this is going to be stable going forward, and so we should use this? So like this is sort of the optimal set of moments, and there's some kind of that this is the right description of the world.
So what we would say first is kind of the moments we pick, and for the way we handle it is really I would think the most natural one, which is really kind of just the decile of the price changes and fraction of the price changes. And also you will see kind of all the four empirical results we will show actually don't depend on any of the specific choice. So we'll show quite a lot of robustness results later on, and at least the baseline qualitative predictions will not depend on any of the specific choice we made. So now we're going to use this encoding as the input for the micro forecast. So the objective is at day t, we try to forecast inflation in months t plus h. So the input is the high dimensional microvector mentioned before with 12 legs together with months dummies. And so in this environment, it seems to be gradient boosting tree is the best performed one. So the idea is to predict with a moderate depth regression tree and predict the residual with next tree, and you keep iterate. And it's basically a type of boosting algorithm. So basically you additively add the prediction signals of a few different regression trees. It does seem to be the case that in this type of environment, it performs a little bit better than random forest, which is bagging averaging in relevant settings. So you may wonder, why don't we use no machine learning methods? And we tried a bit. I think it does seem to leads to more overfit because of the high dimensional predictors relative to the time series. And also here in implementation, we're going to have a 1 XG boost model per horizon. So you can think about this as nonlinear local projection instead of recursive forecast like a VAR. And so then in terms of training and tuning, so the training, we just have the standard rolling window training for 10 years. I think that's reasonable under non-stationarity. So the most tricky part is to tune hyperparameter in real time to avoid look-ahead bias in validation. So in particular, the key hyperparameter here is the learning rate, which is how much its new tree modifies the prediction. So we realized that kind of in some existing paper in the literature, and also even we at the very beginning, it's very difficult to avoid the look-ahead bias when choosing hyperparameters in intuitions. Even if you train based on the real data, if you pick the hyperparameter based on the performance over the entire sample, then you are basically effectively using the information in the future to make forecasts in real time. So for this purpose, we kind of have basically a real-time tuning pipeline in which each candidate hyperparameter, we first use it to generate validation forecast for the past 48 months. And then we're going to select the hyperparameter in real time based on the validation mean absolute value of the past 48 months. And then we're going to generate a forecast from training the model given the particular hyperparameter chosen. And so you can see here, it seems you need to train lots of models during the validation. So computation is somewhat the issue. So we have an efficient computation pipeline in which we cache each forecast for later validation to make the computation reasonable. And we're going to repeat this pipeline for all the months and horizons. And finally, then we have the micro-based forecast. And then the question is, how can we use it to form a combined forecast? So basically, how to exploit the occasional forecasting gains from microdata given the known stationarity. And the idea we had is basically kind of use some of results in the online learning literature in the machine learning, in particular the fixed share algorithms, to shift weights towards the massive and away from it otherwise. And this is also practically valuable because the central bank already have lots of pretty good inflation forecasting approach. So instead of saying, okay, so we should use a completely new one based on micro forecast, I think practically it's best to think about how to combine a micro-based forecast together with the existing approach. So in particular, two existing approach we explore in this pipeline. The one is just a standard univariate seasonally adjusted ARIMA, and we're gonna train tune the hyperparameter exactly in the same way as a machine learning forecast. And in here, the hyperparameter just means ARIMA specifications. You're gonna nest the main univariate specifications in the literature like Atkinson or Honey and the rolling window IMA 11, and it seems to be the most selected specification is the seasonally adjusted ARMA 11. And we also...
So quick question?
Sure.
Quick question. Just, you know, your sort of benchmark model for the microdata is, you know, a pretty sophisticated gradient boosted tree thing. And the benchmark model for that you just went through is just an ARMA.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's pretty feeble competition, right? Why not, I mean, these are all off-the-shelf models. Why not do, you know, a similarly sophisticated modern ML?
Yeah, that's exactly, that's the second benchmark. So we have basically the univariate benchmark, macro ML benchmark,
Okay.
and a micro. So that's, we compare this three. Yeah.
Can I clarify something? Your objective here is forecasting, not seasonally adjusted inflation.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So by the way, allows kind of seasonal adjustment for each of the benchmarks. So we have monthly dummies in our approach, but we also allow the seasonal the RIMA to be seasonally adjusted, and we also allow the macro-based gradient boosting tree.
My question is the thing you are trying to forecast
That's
not
not
seasonally
yeah,
adjusted.
Yeah.
So comparing to the Stock and Watson sector level forecast might be interesting to understand. So like they're doing a thing with sectors and it's kind of nonlinear, but it doesn't have any of the extra ML kind of stuff. And so that would be interesting just to see like what is the marginal gain that you're getting from the ML on sector data relative to kind of a more traditional econometric setup.
Yeah, this sounds an interesting direction we'd like to explore. So
Watson just had a lecture doing exactly that and showing some features that the disaggregated model caught the change in persistent inflation in the United States faster than the aggregate model. So it goes exactly the same.
yeah, we should take a closer look on that.
Sorry, the training window also in this month, is that 10 years?
So it's a rolling window for 10 years, yeah.
Yeah, I think for a nonlinear model, right, and inflation episodes really matter, right? You want to see volatile episodes that benchmark in order to forecast post-COVID. So if you just train on the 10 years leading up to COVID, it's going to be a very dumb nonlinear model, right? Because it hasn't seen anything. The library is very dull. So it's going to be almost like construction. Underperform. So you need a longer training window.
So we tried the expanding window too. I don't think the baseline results change that much, but yeah, we should explore and report more in terms of the, yeah. Although the 70 has tricky, because the microdata is not available in 70, but we could, yeah.
For the
Macro, yeah, yeah, we could,
that's
yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
right, and that is an advantage that's real, right?
Mhm.
Because the macro data does
Yeah.
go further.
Yeah, exactly, that makes sense. So let's go back to this. So basically the idea is we want to have a weighted average of basically all the three forecasts. And so in particular, we're going to use this delayed fixed share algorithm. Why delayed is also to just use the information available at the time to avoid the look ahead bias. And this delayed fixed shares weights in particular basically have two key terms in terms of weights adjustments. So the first term in terms of orange is reweighting, basically moves the mass towards the expert with the best recent performance. And it is governed by this hyperparameter eta. So in particular, if a particular expert like micro forecast is doing well recently, you increase its weight. And so that's basically the orange term. And the second term in terms of adjustment is this mixing term, which is the green term. And it's governed by alpha mixing rate. And the basic idea is basically for each expert, you have a minimum amount of weights. And this allows the dominated experts can regain weight once informative instead of going to zero. For example, the micro forecast, if it doesn't work very well before the pandemic, at least giving it some minimum weights and allow it to recover over time. And for those two hyperparameters, both the learning rate and mixing rate, so we do two approaches. One is we just set as kind of the standard value in the literature based on the sample size. And also, alternatively, we can also tune it in real time. So we try both, and this seems have similar performance. And you may wonder why fixed share? I think there are two advantages. One is interpretable, so you can literally just see the dynamics of weights on the micro data to see the value of the micro data. And second is there is upper bound on the forecast loss with non-stationarity. So in particular, we're going to define this forecast loss based on a notion called dynamic regret, which is a gap between the cumulative forecast loss of our fixed share forecast with the best ex-post forecast. So this is kind of basically an unfair forecast. Is basically you are allowed to use ex-post information, switch across the best forecast, but at most S times. And it captures no stationarity because you can basically switch the best forecast for at most S times. So compared to this even kind of unfair ex-post forecast, still there is an upper bound in the forecast loss in terms of dynamic regret for the fixed share algorithm. In particular, if you set alpha to be the optimal alpha and around small learning rate eta, you can basically have an upper bound of the forecast loss, and actually it's informative about the trade-off with respect to the learning rate eta. So if you have a small learning rate, you're going to have a small first term in this loss, which is basically express the cost of overreacting to noise. So if the learning rate is high and you have some noise, you're just overreacting to the noise. But the benefit of a higher learning rate is in the case that you need to switch the expert, is switch fast. If you have a small learning rate and then you just don't switch fast enough, so that will be the trade-off. And also here it illustrates that if you add a kind of forecast that's not really useful, you're going to introduce more noise, and that's how the scan test it becomes relevant. So before introducing any forecast as an expert into this fixed share algorithm, you would like it to pass the scan test, at least it's occasionally useful before introducing it into the forecasting pipeline. So now let me turn to the results. So the first result is micro outperforms the Serema, but only after 2020. So here is basically the actual inflation together with the Serema forecast. It did a pretty good job before the pandemic, but after the pandemic, it doesn't do a very good job. So in particular, when the inflation goes up, it doesn't really go up, and when the inflation goes down, it's too high. And then if you compare this with the micro-based forecast, it does poorly before 2020, but the error rises by less after 2020. So in particular, for example, when the inflation goes down, it performs much better than the seasonally adjusted Serema.
Just a quick remark. I mean, of course, obviously there's the question of sort of why and when is one outperforming the other. And I just wanted to point out there's a really interesting paper by Hashem Pesavine that no one seems to know about. It's like 25 years old. It's on top-down versus bottom-up forecasting, exactly this sort of issue.
I see.
And he asks, can you write down conditions when it's better to go with the micro, bottom-up? And the answer is, in general, no. It actually depends on the degree of micro-parameter heterogeneity and on the nature, the variance-covariance structure of the micro shocks. But, to the extent that you're getting micro sometimes helpful, sometimes not. So that's moving around. It's got to be, it would seem, that either the amount of micro heterogeneity or the variance covariance structure of those shocks is time variant. Then the question, of course, would be, well, why is that happening? But, you know, at least there's some work that's been done that might be useful there.
Yeah, we should definitely connect more to the particular paper you mentioned. So later on, we're actually going to briefly discuss from the lens of the standard manual cost model, and we're going to point to a few directions that how microdata can help, but this particular paper seems very relevant. We should take a closer look.
And also on that note, I mean, you are forecasting, as Jonathan also asked about earlier, you are forecasting a non-seasonally adjusted outcome, which I think is very cool. But this picture, by using this 3-month moving average, I'd like to see if microdata actually helps not, making more accurate inflation forecast overall, but actually for specific months, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you follow the big retail season in November, December. Every year, if you find that the microdata, is useful there, that would be very, very cool. And you can do that. I know you have monthly dummies, 12 monthly dummies on the right-hand side, but you should also have it in the forecast evaluation, the debug my tests, right? And then see actually, does the microdata just work, not just only occasionally or overall, post-COVID, but in specific months.
Okay, that's interesting. We could explore. Yeah.
So based on this graph, this post-COVID graph, I mean, it looks like to me your Sarima is just falling apart in the post-COVID era because it's so affected by those huge. So it almost looked like to me that you wouldn't outperform an even simpler model of almost like a constant mean type forecast because your model is much better at getting back to essentially this underlying mean. So, it seems like what you're doing here is kind of helping to reduce the noise.
Yeah, I think that's true. So it does seem to be kind of the standard univariate forecast does seem to not do very well post-COVID. So yeah, we should check a bit more. I think it's possible. I think just a constant forecast performs better than the Sarima after the COVID. So here is a more systematic evaluation about the mean absolute value error improvement of the micro forecast relative to Sarima by a horizon and evaluation window. And you can see as the micro is certainly not a panacea. In fact, before the pandemic, the micro-based forecasts underperformed Sarima quite badly. So it kind of the average mean absolute value, the deterioration is around maybe 20%. But post-pandemic actually does pretty well. So micro outperforms Sarima at almost all horizons, with gains reaching about 40% at long horizons. And you can also do the scan test, and then it does seem to be, you can reject the null hypothesis that micro never outperforms Sarima. So in this sense, the micro has localized forecasting power, but instead of the full sample dominance.
Can I ask a question on this slide? This is a small point, but I'm guessing you estimate the models used by minimizing sum of squared errors.
Mm-hmm.
When you're evaluating the forecast using absolute errors, there's a mismatch here between estimation and evaluation. And if inflation is right skewed, like Ian was hinting at, or others have looked at, you're going to have the optimal forecast is different. Have you?
Yeah, so we report both in the paper, and in fact, when we train, we also tried both. The baseline machine learning package is square errors, but we also have a little bit try on our own, use the train based on MAE. But I think that issue is going to become computationally much more costly. So that's why we use just the baseline pipeline. But the basic idea is basically for the like online learning part. The regret guarantee is based on mean absolute value. So that's why we would like to use mean absolute values. It's basically the only place that's based on squared is just the baseline machine learning package, but because that's computationally much more efficient. So that's the first result. So basically the microdata seems to have some localized forecasting improvement. And then the second result is just formally which forecast should we add into the combined online learning forecast. So we include the expert only if it improves the forecast at least for some interval horizons via the scan test. So we start with Sarima, and which is I think the most standard one. Then we try to add the macro. It does seem to be the macro is useful compared to Sarima just on average. So we introduce macro. And then on top of micro and Surima, we ask the question, should we introduce micro? Compared to Surima, as we already reported, there is occasional outperformance. And if you compare micro versus macro, actually there is just overall outperformance. So basically then it seems to be all the three experts, all the three forecasts, Surima, micro, and micro, should be introduced in this scan test, introduced in this combined online learning forecast. So we have all three experts in the forecasting pool. And then here you can see the forecast with this adaptive machine learning approach, so which is basically the combined forecast, which is the orange line. And here in particular, I think it can because the weights is chosen kind of adaptively, it's useful in the sense like before the pandemic, it kind of tracks the Surima forecast fairly well, and after the pandemic, it adaptively moved away from the Surima forecast and become closer to the micro forecast.
So just going back, in that graph, I guess one thing to consider is that it's what you're. I'm sure that this is the correct Surima forecast, but this doesn't. The super simple baselines that you would think of, I feel like wouldn't look like this. So like if you think about like what all the Fed's forecasts look like in that period, they just basically acted like AR1s almost. That like it was just here we are and we're going to slowly converge back down. And you could have a random walk where it's here we are and we're going to stay here forever. And this doesn't look like either of those. And it feels as though those would have outperformed because at least when inflation like shot up, like this, the forecasts aren't rising until late 2023. But, I think in general, the like professional forecasts and like the things that most people were looking at had kind of figured this out by 2022. So it's hard to square this with, I guess, like what I think of as the forecast that like people typically have in their minds for inflation in this period.
So yeah, so I think the reason why we go this is we want to treat the univariate exactly the same way as how we treat the other forecasts. We also compare with some super simple forecasts like constant or random walk. I think it's the baseline kind of qualitative lesson is correct. For example, the micro is worse before pandemic and better after pandemic. Joe, you seem to want to add something.
Just one thing. I think you're right about the forecasts. I think it's easy to forget. So this is a 12-month ahead forecast. So for sure, at quarterly frequency, like things get a lot better, a lot quicker. But we're deliberately doing the hardest thing. I think if you look at professional forecasts, again, 12 months ahead, they don't look that impressive at this stage.
Maybe adding one more thing. So for our adaptive Surima training, turns out most of the times you do have AR1, but like if you just compare that with using AR1 or like the random walk model or IMA1, turns out this one is better in terms of MAE.
So it's basically just that this is it's just the time shift that this is like those two peaks in 2023 are basically just mirroring to the two peaks in 2022. Is that essentially what's going on? Okay.
So then we can also report this more systematically. So pre-pandemic, the combined forecast is going to have similar performance compared to the seasonally adjusted Surima. Remember, if you have the micro-only forecast, it's much worse than Surima before pandemic. But having this adaptive algorithm, which basically adaptively combines three forecasts, avoids the shortcoming of the micro forecast before the pandemic. So basically, before the pandemic, it has similar performance compared to Surima. But post-pandemic, you can maintain the gain of the micro data by shifting weights towards the micro data. So the combined forecast outperforms Surima, in fact, at all horizons post-pandemic. And another value of this kind of online learning approach is you can just visualize the weights. And in particular, if you look at the green line, which is the weights on the micro data, it starts to increase after the pandemic. So you can see kind of 2021, 2022, 2023 in particular it peaks. But when the inflation goes down, it starts to go down again. So you can visualize basically the value of the micro data through the weights. And another thing that's useful to understanding the time varying value of the micro data is to combine the 3 expert forecast with the 2 expert forecast. It's basically the same online learning, but you don't use micro data. You just combine the univariate Surima together with the macro data. And here again, it's kind of pre-COVID is kind of similar, but post-COVID you can see a pretty major increase adding macro lowers MAE at 19 out of 24 horizons by 2.9% on average. And you can also do additional tests, and you can show that the 3 expert forecast with micro data improve on the 2 expert benchmark, in fact, not just occasionally, on average after the pandemic. And one natural question is, why don't you just throw everything in an XG boost? You can just throw in macro data lag inflation in one XG boost. So this is related to the estimation error point we mentioned. It's kind of, if you do that, in fact, it just kind of, there are just too many predictors, and this, if anything, going to introduce noise because the number of predictors higher than even than basically the number of months. And so here it's compared to the combined forecast, this basically throw everything into a XG boost actually performs a little bit worse. And we also try kind of the robustness. It's kind of, you can have richer encoding, you can have equal weighted, you can drop sales or impute regular prices, and we have similar results. And to wrap up, basically it's kind of, we can also basically have a group Shapley value approach, and you can see basically what moments matters, and in particular, it seems the moments that matters is the decile of the price change, but interestingly, not the fraction of the price changes. And so in terms of connecting to the manual cost model, this can, this seems to be consistent with model either with granularity or with a lot of a kind of non-linearity or large shocks. So to conclude, it seems kind of, it's useful to kind of consider how to develop a pipeline or develop tests to harness the occasional forecasting power of the micro data, and this is what we do here, and we plan to explore this for other macro variables in the future. Thanks.
We should hold questions because we're a little over. So can we go on to the next paper?
Okay, thanks a lot for having us. It's a great pleasure to present this paper to this crowd, as we build on many who have been here before us. So this is about granular economic modeling, gauging hourly economic activity in your neighborhood. So what are the dynamics of economic activity? So this question is basically the heart of economic analysis. However, with data limitation and methodology limitations, we still focus very much on aggregate levels. And we have 2 levels of aggregate. We have time, so we look at quarterly, monthly, or at very high frequency, we consider weekly frequencies. Or we have another dimension, which is space. And we consider aggregates at nationwide, countrywide, as country, or state. So this limitation, what we do in this paper is that we try to push these limitations, and we try to move steps towards analyzing economic activity at much finer levels of granularity, which means hourly levels and zip code levels. So why do we care? Why should we care? Or why should you care about granular economic activity? If we start thinking about questions like, how does aggregate government spending cascade down to local economies? So when DC decides to spend, to invest, to stimulate the economy, how does that affect every local economy? So we have a lot of heterogeneity that we don't still understand. And so these questions, to understand this question and to answer, to understand this heterogeneity, we need to have measures of economic activity at much finer levels of granularity. So in other words, we need to understand granular economic activity. And this is what we do in this paper. We try to move steps towards this granular economic activity understanding. Okay? So in one plot, what our framework will be able to enable or to allow steps towards is to study what is when the government decided to spend to stimulate the economy after the COVID in 2021 with the economic impact payment, what is the impact that these billions or trillions of dollars that this is spending in the economy are having across the local communities. So for example, this is plotting the impact that that stimulus of several billions had on San Diego GDP. And you can see that we kind of can estimate like how much that boosted the local economy and have measures of local multipliers. These can then be used for policy implications, for studying how that can be different from, for example, LA, and direct policy in a much clearer dimension. Okay? So to do this contribution, we are going to have actually a set of smaller contributions. So we're going to use, to rely a lot of alternative data series. So these are new data that are available at the high frequency and much finer levels of granularity. Then we are going to show how this data, these alternative data, which have these new features that how do they square up with, how can they be mixed, how can they be merged with traditional macroeconomic data, which are aggregate, are low frequency, but they have the economic interpretation. And so we are going to build this modeling and methodology. And then we are going to show when we put the data into the modeling, what kind of new empirical features can we reveal? What can this new information tell us? And to complement the framework, we are going to also push a set of tools, such as event detection, policy analysis tools, scenario analysis, and we're going to show how this can be used to get this better understanding of these granular economies and how this enhance the whole understanding of economic analysis. Okay. Okay. As I said, it's a great honor to present here because we are building on shoulders on the many of many people that are also in this room, and we build on the large nowcasting, real-time detection, dynamic modeling. So all these things that we take from there and build new stuff. Okay, so the outline of the talk will be that I'm going to discuss the data, which is a key component of our contribution. Then I'm going to show you the modeling and the methodology part. So we will move to the results, to the empirical results. And then I'm going to show you what we can do with these new approaches. So this is really not just one paper that proposes one measure, but this is a step towards this new way of thinking about how can we move from these aggregates in space and time to the disaggregate levels and use this to enhance our better understanding of what drives economic activity and what are these dynamics. Okay, so let me start immediately with the data. And so to achieve this task of disaggregating these dynamics, we need these two new dimensions of granularity. This table is showing these two dimensions. So if you look on the x-axis, we have the time dimension, which is what we are almost always concerned with, which is going from hourly levels here, so very high frequency, to yearly level. And then if you look instead on the y-axis, you can see that there's a spatial dimension that moves from zip code level to the state level. Okay? So what we define to be a granular time series is a time series that starts bottom to the left. Bottom left will be zip code hourly. And you can see that there are some proxies, some time series like traffic flow, foot traffic, electricity usage. So these are very granular time series that are available at these very most high frequencies. So, and these two frequencies are both in both dimensions. So you have the high frequency from time, and you have the granularity in space from the zip code. Okay. Then, as you move into these data metrics to the 45-degree line, you can you lose both dimensions of granularity. Okay. So if you move only on one axis, you lose one dimension of granularity. So for example, if you move to the right, you lose time granularity. If you move up, you lose spatial granularity. If you move on the 45 line, you lose both granularity. Okay? So what we are interested in our approach is to use both dimensions of granularity. So what we basically do is that we start from this hourly level, and we focus on this hourly zip code series of proxies, and we take food traffic flows, electricity usage, and weather data. So these proxies, like food traffic, is taken from mobile ping phones, and these are measures of how many people are in a given location, in this case in a zip code, in a given hour. And if you start thinking about some zip codes, they have shopping malls, they have restaurants, they have industries, they have factories, they have plants. So this comes to be a way of proxying how many people, how many input of production or how many units of consumption are in a given slot at any given timing point. Okay, and this point is hourly. And traffic flow, electricity usage, and weather, you can think about them in the same way as being input of production of consumption in that in this kind of function that then produces economic activity. The second set of series that here we start losing one dimension of granularity, but is still at a high frequency, is daily zip code level and is credit card and debit card spending data. So this is a direct measure of consumption where we can basically get anonymized spending data on purchases and spend dollars.
Just to clarify,
Yes.
I'm just curious, do you get those credited debit transactions from one vendor, like Visa, or somebody else, does somebody aggregate them across vendors?
So we get them from one vendor, which is not Visa, and he has, yeah, and then
That's now we know.
it's basically it's called SafeGraph. It's a data vendor which serves many hedge funds and big institutions, and they source basically from apps like even Apple Pay and. I'm not sure they have Visa, because Visa, they have their own data set that they sell themselves. So it depends very much on how the credit card companies they decide to handle that business. So yeah, and then on top of yes, Larry.
And location here, it seems like you could either think about that in terms of where people live or where they actually spend the money.
We actually got just new data that allows us to dissect like where people live, where people work, and where people actually move around. So that will allow us to then dissect and to visits from home and those dynamics.
But when you're thinking about measuring this, which is the measure of location you have in mind? So most people live and spend in different zip codes.
Well, we don't separate that. So
When you're deciding which zip code to attribute it to, is it the zip code they live in or they spend in?
they spend in.
Okay.
Yes, yes. Okay, and so on top of this series of at a high granularity and that we can call alternative data series, we also merge the traditional macroeconomic series. And we take the monthly payroll data and the annual GDP data at the local level. That in this case, the local level will be, so these are all data for San Diego County, and we have a span of 3 years, which goes from 2021 to 2023 included, okay? So, and we use this traditional data and the macro data to kind of bridge, to hook the alternative data series with economic interpretation.
Sorry, I'm
Yes.
curious. If I buy online, what zip code is that purchase attributed to? Where I live, or the, I don't know, like, I'm thinking, I don't know, a random company, Amazon.
So this is related to a physical point of interest, location. So all those online
So that would be
transactions.
my IP, like at my computer.
Right. No. These are physical transactions, meaning that you need to be in. Yes, we talked about when you have richer data sets where you have also online transactions. We talked about how should this accounting be imputed, and it's kind of not a trivial point. Luckily, we don't have data to deal with that because we actually, if we had a richer data set with online transactions that we could remove. If we want to include them, then we need to take a stand on where do we want to really attribute that, and it's difficult, kind of. Yeah. So let me also, these are for the most are new data series that we're bringing in. So let me just briefly show you what this empirical stylized fact of this series look like. So we have that this series, they have a lot of hour of day variation. So these are the 4 hourly time series that we use. And you can see that, for example, if you look at traffic flow, there are 2 peaks within each daily cycle that coincide. The first peak is around 9 a.m., which is what is the commuting pattern of people to offices. And then there's a second peak, which is from after 3 p.m., which is the commuting back home pattern. So this also foot traffic, you can see it has a peak in the middle of the day around 1, which is the walk from office to pick up lunch or things like that. And then same for electricity and temperature, they have this kind of common, sort of this hint to a common component, okay? If we look at the actual week of day-or-week variation, we can actually see these patterns even more. Some more interesting kind of patterns, like in traffic flow, you can see that there's a clear weekend effect during the Saturday and Sundays. This series, they have this much smoother behavior. There's not this double peak effect, which is associated with commuting to work. Foot traffic has, again, same behavior with this peak around noon. And then electricity and temperature. And you can see that really what one striking feature of these plots is that this series seems to have some co-movement, okay? And this is indeed what kind of we then took as a starting point for the modeling. So this kind of, there are these definitely like a lot of intraday variation, there's a lot of intra-week variation, but there's this idea of a common component, okay? However, before then getting there is, okay, but these series are totally unconnected at first with economic activity, so can they proxy for it? And so what we do as a kind of sanity check is to run this, we call it the payroll regression. So we take this total pay variable, which is what we use as a monthly payroll proxy, and we try to associate all these, the variation in this high frequency series with the variation in the traditional series. Okay, so what we find is that there's a clear positive association between the granular time series, so these hourly proxies, and the payroll data. So what does it mean? This is building motivation to associate these hourly or these anyway alternative data proxies with traditional aggregates of economic activity. Okay, and so yes.
I'm not sure how to interpret. I understand the spirit, but doesn't the aggregation? So this is at the monthly.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So
yes.
I'm totally fine that electricity and payroll are correlated at the monthly level. That doesn't imply that the fact that the electricity is consumed more in the evening means that people hire more in the evening. That seems like a very different space.
Right. But so this is just a sanity check to establish, okay, if we aggregate this series and we smooth out in the aggregation, you definitely lose information, right? Which is what this project instead is trying to do. So if we aggregate and we lose some information, but we allow some sort of, we smooth out these dynamics and we allow this sort of common component to kind of be more apparent, can we find a positive relationship between the two series? So the economic series and this aggregated alternative series. So it's a way of, let's say that you polish the common underlying factor and you see if at the low frequencies, once you have thrown out all the kind of short-term noise or whatever, there's a positive association between the two.
But I guess that's what I'm saying, that most of the variation at the very high temporal frequency that you showed us earlier
right. But
is meaningful it just speaks to something different, is
But-
my point.
But that is then giving you us a way of, if I know that this relationship exists at the monthly level, and the monthly level is definitely due to the aggregation, is the result of the aggregation of the hourly series, right? And that is giving you the motivation to use the hourly series to grasp this underlying common component at the hourly level. Because the monthly series, even if you would observe payroll, when you observe payroll at the monthly series, is the sum of a process that generates in continuous time. In principle, you can think about it like that way. The only reason why you have monthly payroll is because you can observe it at monthly frequency. But it doesn't mean that it's generated at monthly frequency, right? And so this is really what is behind this approach, and how also we build the estimation of the algorithm and everything is in the modeling. You can think about it as economic activity is generated in continuous time. The only reason why we focus on the aggregate is because of these limitations that I was speaking of at the beginning. And so if we can kind of show up that there's some point there is some co-movement, then that is a good motivation to go and use what we can instead measure at high frequency to pin down this process at high frequency. Okay?
Can I follow up on that? It sounds a little bit related to like spectrum regression. Like this question is really monthly variation in these right-hand side variables is associated with monthly variation in payroll. But that doesn't necessarily imply that hourly variation in those variables is associated with hourly variation in payroll. Now maybe it is, and that's what you'd like to be true. But
Yeah.
we haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, I'll show you how we actually, once I show you how we model with the granular economic modeling, you will see how actually these things come together. Because so what we basically, that regression bias was, okay, here there's some common component that some sort of economic interpretation of this series. At least let's take it at monthly frequency. There's some anyway positive association with monthly payroll. So if we can, what we then did was to start moving towards, okay, how do we then model some sort of these high frequency variations? And so what we have to do is that how do we model a variable like, electricity usage from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., what we are using in this room in East Cambridge. We then, when we will go to dinner in North End this evening between 6 and 7 p.m., right? We have all these data heterogeneity, these series that we have to model. And given that what I showed you about this kind of hinting to a common component that exists not only across the hourly variables, but with the low frequency standard macroeconomic aggregate. So what we do is that we set up a baseline frequency, baseline hourly frequency dynamic factor model. So we take each of these series at the hourly frequency and at the zip code level. And what we basically do is that we model it as a first common component. This Lea factor is the local economic activity component, and then an idiosyncratic component. Okay, so and the idea is that if you start then from this high frequency, so the hourly frequency, what you can do is that that Lea component is kind of you can think about it as our DGP factor, so our true factor. And then all the other series that do not move at hourly frequency, like daily spending, what we do is that we write a temporally aggregated model, or if it is a series which is spatially aggregated, like county level GDP, we write it as a spatiotemporally aggregated model. And these spatiotemporal restrictions that are imposed on the series and on the factor will actually tie down all the system. So that that factor that we see in annual San Diego GDP payroll, annual San Diego GDP, is actually the temporal aggregation of this hourly factor. So this hourly factor is the baseline local economic activity at the hourly level, and then aggregating it at all different frequencies, we will be able to recover a coherent object which is going to be the factor at the different frequencies in time, okay? And so we model it in a very simple way, like with a local linear in two components. One is a slow-moving mean, the other is a deterministic calendar component. And the reason why we have this calendar component is that we do as little as manipulations as possible on the data. Why? We don't even seasonally adjust them, because all this is information that we want to keep in the data and we want to capture systematically with these processes. And then we define the local economic activity process as the sum of the two, so that you can think about the economic activity of that one is interested in analyzing is the sum of the two components. And the two components just reveal different information. Okay, so it's a very rich model that actually, even if it is so simple, allows for many things, because you can think that if you want to have idiosyncratic specific components, you can include them in the idiosyncratic term. And so the common, what we are only after is this common variation that we can then show is attributable to economic activity. Okay, so then we need to estimate, once we have set up this model, we need to estimate it, and we do it in two ways, in two steps. So a first step consists of spatial pooling and this cascade Kalman filter, and this step allows us to estimate the economic activity factor. And then the second step is about getting the heterogeneity, which comes from this factor loading beta Si. Okay, so the spatial pooling and the cascade Kalman filter, basically they take care of the fact that if you think about this data, we have that each year you have about 9,000 hourly observations, and then you also have the fact that you have all these zip codes. So the spatial pooling is basically taking care of the second thing that I said, which is the zip code. So it's aggregating basically all these variables across zip codes, and aggregating from zip code to the level we are interested in, which in this case is county level. We get rid of the spatial dimension, okay? Because that dimension will be recovered in the second step with the second regression. And then we set the cascade Kalman filter to account for the fact that not only we have high dimensional time series, so these 9,000 hourly observations every year, but we also have mixed frequencies. And this goes back to the question that we have monthly payroll, annual GDP, and how do we ensure that the factor that we get from hourly then is consistent with these lower frequency macro aggregates. And this is exactly what the Kalman filter is actually doing, is ensuring that that object, that FHTH, which is the hourly economic activity, is consistent across the time scale. Yes?
So imagine you had a variable.
Yes.
And it's some choice that I make, and it's related to my consumption, and it's a thing that fluctuates over the course of the day in a way that I don't even control.
Mm-hmm.
It just moves around over the course of the day, and what I choose is just the monthly level.
Mm-hmm.
So I move the level up and down, and then it, for some exogenous reason, just fluctuates around. So that might be electricity usage, but it might be something else. Just imagine it's a thing. And so these, by assumption, the hour-to-hour fluctuations have no economic meaning.
Mm-hmm.
But the monthly fluctuations, again, by assumption, are related to monthly consumption. Just that, that is imagine it's just, I literally set it proportional to my other monthly spending. I have aggregate monthly spending, I've decided, and I'm going to set this monthly thing that I've just made up to be proportional to that aggregate monthly spending.
So I guess this is a question about, so the aggregation that goes on into the variables, is it a stock aggregation or a flow aggregation problem? And the way we see this is that this is these variables are flow variables, so that if you write down the DGP of these variables at hourly frequency and you aggregate them at a lower frequency, that factor should show up in the aggregate.
That I get, and so that might even be true in my example, right? That if I add up this thing over the course of the month, it's correlated or it's proportional to my monthly spending. But then what I'm saying is by assumption, the hour-to-hour variation in that thing has no relationship.
It will be washed out by the idiosyncratic. It will be basically, since it's uncorrelated with the economic activity, the common component, that variation will be absorbed by the idiosyncratic component, even
Okay,
if
good.
it will be systematic.
Great. So then my question is, what in the data? So I can see how like that's ideally what we want the model to do. What in the data lets you do that? So like.
Excellent. So it's exactly this cascade Kalman filter with this structure of temporal aggregation. So in the F that you can see, that FYR, which stands for yearly and monthly, when we write down the filter, which basically is this one, you can see that the state, which is alpha HT, which is our factor, is basically constructed always as imposing these temporal aggregation constraints from the hourly frequency. So that object is kept consistent by this kind of, there are almost accounting identities that ensure that that object from all these series is always kind of filtered the same. And in fact, we have this kind of two identification restrictions from GDP and payroll that basically tie down that component to economic activity.
But so do you observe, it seems as though the argument that you just made requires that there is some hourly benchmark that you can use to say, like...
We do it with the annual GDP. That's our benchmark that is hooking that is identifying the economically identifying the factor. Because once you do it at that level with the GDP, then it doesn't matter that you use as baseline the hourly frequency. The reason why we want to use the baseline hourly frequency is that it's the highest frequency we can go. But then since the object has this kind of counting identity, it's kind of kept coherent by the GDP and the payroll.
My question's kind of related because it seems like the highest frequency, almost unambiguous economic variables you have are these like job posting and building permits.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm used to seeing that and representing economic activity. But it just seems like, and this goes to the stock and flow that you said, it seems like there's some kind of character to those things that might be pretty lumpy. And maybe it's about like building up the need to post for the jobs or just randomly posting. So do you differentially treat variables like that versus like the daily spending variable in terms of this adding up constraint? Like if a firm just decides to post all its jobs on one Thursday, is that saying that that Thursday's economic activity spiked up, or that the activity leading up to that Thursday?
The activity leading up to that, we can control for that. Yes, okay. Yes, we can. Yeah, and so this is basically the cascade Kalman filter, how it's kind of moving down and from up to down. And then the second step that we do is about getting these betas, which is just a standard regression. Okay, let me get to the empirical results. So this is what we find as the weekly cycle of hourly economic activity in San Diego. So this is one specific realization. So the left scale, the right scale, which is what I want you to focus on, is showing the percentage variation from the mean, the mean of the unconditional mean of the economic activity factor. So you can see that the intraday variation is going from minus 65% to 106%. Okay, so this is huge intraday variation. So on average, we document that intraday variation is about 200%. So you have that from bottom of the night to top of the day. You have these kind of huge excursions. And one way to see it is that if we look at what the hour of day dynamics look like, we can see that they resemble a lot of, they pick up this stylized fact of the hourly time series. And you can see that, so these plots are showing what happens when you actually have, you look at weekdays, weekends, holidays, because as we show in the kind of what this series look like, we document that, these are facts that are in those series as they affect behavior, they affect jobs, they affect the way that we travel, we pick up kids from schools. And you can see that then the Lea factor is picking up, is representative of some of those dynamics.
Sorry.
Yes?
So the one before.
Yes.
So the amplitude of this variation
Yes.
is informed by your daily
Our,
indicators.
Yes. Yes.
Within the indicators,
Mhm.
right? So the implicit assumption is that those indicators give you a good sense of what the amplitude, which, I mean, it's reasonable. At night, we sleep, we don't use electricity,
Right,
we
right,
don't
right,
walk,
right.
and therefore we are also not consuming. So
Right.
it's not crazy.
Right.
But that's where the information comes from. Like the fact that you sum it up and then at the end of the month, this is kind of centered at the right place in
Right,
terms of employment, that is kind of in the mean, right? But this amplitude is informed by what I would say are, not super obviously correlated things with economic activity. You're kind of defining economic activity as the thing that moves up and down within the day in a way that is informed by the measures that you happen to have. And that's kind of a definition that we need to accept, right?
Right. So I think, right, but once you average and you only, if, we can, one way of seeing this as, this is information in the sense that if we only draw the unconditional mean on this plot, we only see one line that goes, maybe from 1.2, let's say, okay? So, but once we know that there's all this intraday variation, then we can start thinking about, but what happens if we have that, we have some sort of an unexpected event that is, as I will show in the example, is that we were able to detect a plane landing on the Interstate I-5 in California, and in the middle of the day with the model. And then you can start asking, okay, but what is the economic loss of this plane landing on the interstate and traffic flow being stuck for 5 hours? And then we can quantify that was $40 million. And why is that? Because people, trucks, they ship, they move around input of production. And if you have in this intraday variation, which is economic activity, right? So this is the true process of economic activity, which is kind of, not the true process, but is what it should look like. You have some sort of, abrupt variation or some sort of breakdown. What is the loss to the total economic production? Which if I will plot the kind of line, we wouldn't see. It's like only you go to the doctor once every year and the doctor says, oh, you're good. But then within the year you feel very bad because you have this short-term kind of sickness, right? So the year-on-year check, you're doing great, but then month-to-month you feel very bad. So, and this is a way to move towards that direction. So I don't want to look just week by week, but I want to see how within the week I'm doing, right? So that is where we're going. So if you look at the economy every 10 years, we are doing great, but within those 10 years, we have a lot of fluctuation. So these are the factor loadings. And this is when you aggregate then seasonality in the economic activity factor. But, and also, this, in the paper we showed that you can correlate it with weekly unemployment claims that we don't use in the estimation, especially for this way of validating the factor. But let me, for the sake of time, go to show you at least one application of what we can do with this approach, okay? And I want to focus on the, so there are many things that we can do, event detection, fiscal policy, forecasting, but what I want to show you is the granular, what really can be done with this approach, which is the study of the AIP program, okay? So basically the AIP program was, as I said, was this rescue plan of the aggregate U.S. economy, where they spent $1 trillion, and is going to, they dispersed to each eligible individual about $1,400, and we have a set of official dates from March to May 2021, where these dollars were dispersed. And this allows us to go in and see how does the factor, the Leah factor, reacts to these payments, to these stimulus, okay? So and what we actually go in, what we can do with this approach is that we can go in and we can see what are the dynamics of the Leah factor of the local economic activity as a result of this spending. And you can see how pre and post stimulus the economic activity is reacting. You can see that the blue line is the pre-stimulus Leah, the red line is the post-stimulus, and then the black line is showing you the difference. And you can see that there is a clear boost in economic activity, which is coming in kind of the central hour of the day and the second part of the nighttime, towards the nighttime activity. Okay, and then what we can do is go one step further and start thinking about how can we use all these to measure local spending multipliers, right? Macroeconomists are always interested in if the US government spends $1, how much the dollar gets multiplied and gets kind of boosted in the economy. But it is at an aggregate level. And maybe if we start looking at the disaggregate level, there's a way of, instead of getting that dollar to 1.25 to 1.4, which means that every dollar is going to yield more, and so it's going to benefit the economy more. Or maybe that some areas should receive more money at some given time to optimally increment economic activity, okay? So for example, with the EIP that came, the third stimulus, we estimate that 3.7 billion that were given to San Diego area resulted in an increment of 4.5 billion, which is about 1.25 local multiplier, okay, which was the plot that I showed you at the beginning. And then there's also all this granularity that you can exploit, meaning that not only you can look at this sort of stimulus, like cumulative stimulus, but you can go and see, for example, within the zip codes areas, you can see within the nighttime, like this plot is showing between nighttime in Fridays and Saturdays how economic activity is changing. So you can start thinking about how also the economic behavior of people shapes these local patterns. So you can really start asking a lot of questions. Yes, sir.
So is a question that you asked, like, did they spend the money at bars? Like, bumping on Saturday night.
I won't take a stand on that.
Well, we have the data now.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So we will be able
Well, actually, this plot is done basically in the paper. Then we have a double DID experiment. So the way we construct this plot is constructing portfolios of zip codes that are classified by kind of their entertainment value. So meaning that we look at which zip codes are actually populated by number of recreational activities, and we kind of then look at this type of, we call it the ELE, the entertainment and leisure effect, and then we can start seeing how the consumption patterns changes due to things.
Like in North Park versus La Jolla.
Exactly, yes, exactly. Or Gaslamp District, yes, exactly. So, and then, the paper is, as I said, we like to think about it as a framework, not just a measurement. And then what we do is, for example, we can propose scenario analysis, which is something to, policy makers, they are always interested to answer what-if questions. So this scenario analysis is a tool that we can go in and analyze what-if questions at these finer levels of granularity. So for example, this plot is showing you the cumulative loss in economic activity that happens if you shut down one of those hourly time series that I show you. So the scale of the plot is in a percentage point of daily San Diego GDP. So each one of those points is $10 million. And last week in my zip code area, there was a blackout that lasted from 2 p.m. to 2 a.m. And you can see that that was in the middle of the day, and it probably costed like 20 million more than what would have costed if it was only in the overnight, okay? And yeah, so then we can also do things like event detection. This is what I was talking before. So you can spot, this was in Del Mar, you can spot these sort of abnormal variations in economic activity, and then you can quantify them. So for example, this happened in I don't know if the pointer works, but it happened in basically down where you see the 5 in Del Mar, and it locked the whole I-5. Basically, the whole I-5 was stuck in a traffic jam. And so all these zip codes for 5 hours were not in the I-5, which is a major highway that connects San Diego to Los Angeles, was not it was not possible to drive through. And so we estimate that with our model, the GDP loss that day was 45 million. And then we decided to do a back of the envelope computation with how the traffic office computes traffic jam cost. And we found it was 40. Because at the beginning, how do you evaluate this 45 million? It was just a number on a blackboard. So we did this back of the envelope calculation, and it's basically turned out to be very close. And so we thought this is kind of, is giving you a pretty good sense of how these measures, at the end of the day, are proxying for, so are giving you something which is consistent. Okay, so to wrap up, basically what we try to do with this project is to really push the boundaries of economic activity studies, of the study of economic activity, from these aggregate levels in time and space to these levels of granularity, which definitely reveal a lot of information. Remember, the aggregate is the sum of the parts. And what we're trying to do is to shed light on the parts. To do that, we're trying to build, this is a framework, a way to think about these problems in a new way. And there are many extensions, many implications. So there's empirics, data, modeling, granular, so forecasting. So there's there are a lot of challenges and opportunities ahead, and we actually look forward to your comments and new avenues for research. Thank you.
We have time for a quick question.
Very interesting talk. So here at a high level, you have this high frequency measurement, and you benchmark this using like low frequency, and you can convert it into dollar values. So this is similar to like what happens in development economics, where people are using nightlight data or satellite data to approximate high frequency local economic activities. But there, one issue, maybe this is related to a stock flow kind of question. So like in the original paper, they just directly regress GDP on the nightlight, and you got like 0.9 R squared, which is perfect. But if you take first order difference, then the R squared will go down to like 0.09.
Right.
So like, have you seen any of this here?
So you mean to take the first difference?
Yeah, it's like, does this spurious regression kind of thing, or would you worry about that in any sense?
Well, no, because in our case, or at least what we do in our case is that the model that we impose is non-stationary, is a local level, is an I2 model, so it's taking already care of much of that. Those guys, they just run the regression, and so they have a complete reduced form specification. What we do in our modeling, we have this local linear level model, which is taking care of this kind of trending and potentially non-stationary behavior. So there's no problem for us of non-stationarity or spurious regression of that kind because of the modeling, the way we model the slow-moving mean component. And then we have also the calendar component, which is instead taking care of all these systematic deterministic component related to the calendar effects. So, yeah.
Okay, coffee outside. We reconvene at 10:30.
Fundamental
Thank you so much. Really excited to be here and presenting this joint work on forecasting social science, evidence from 100 projects. Now this is a little bit different than many of the papers we've seen here. This is on forecasting research results. And there are many reasons why you might think forecasting research results is important for R&D firms. This is moving automatically, is it? Okay. For R&D firms, it could inform which drugs to test or which products to develop. For researchers, it could inform your choice of which papers to write. It could even inform the design of experiments, not just your sample size, but how many times, for example, to ask a question on a panel survey. They also feed into the interpretation of evidence. So you might think of forecasts of research results as essentially a benchmark against which new results could be compared, or potentially as an alternative null hypothesis against which, again, to test your results. So then, given these many potential uses, we need to know about the accuracy of forecasts of research results. In particular, are researchers over-optimistic about effect sizes? And if so, that would mean that they might underpower their surveys. Are some forecasters more accurate than others, and what is associated with that? And can forecasts of research results help you in your design of experiments decide which treatment arms to run, etc.? So we're going to be drawing on evidence from the Social Science Prediction Platform, which is a platform that Stefano Della Vigna and I set up in mid-2020. And if you look at all the studies up through the end of 2024, there were 100 projects. You can think of this as like a study posted on the platform. Each study has many questions that it asks about. So in total, we have just shy of 1,500 key questions. So roughly 15 per study. Not all of them are forecasting treatment effects. Many of them are. 71 of these 100 projects have some kinds of estimates of treatment effects there. Some are just asking about summary statistics. So something like, what was the take-up rate of this particular program, say? And of these 100, 66 have posted results. So some of them haven't resolved yet. And we have 4,700 some human forecasters making over 50,000 forecasts in total. Great. So here's the overall process. So the researchers might have a design in mind. They might even have some preliminary results. If they have a paper, then it can't be public, obviously, or people would know the results already. They inquire with the platform and maybe get IRB approval if it's needed at their home institutions. Some institutions think it's important for forecasting surveys, some don't. They design a short survey, and the team gives some comments and assists with the survey. And then both the SSPP team and the authors of that study advertise their surveys however they like, their forecasting surveys. So there's a lot of leeway for the authors. Sometimes they want to send it to particular individuals who are expert in that area using individualized links. Sometimes they want to send it to the forecasting panel, which is a free service that is offered by the platform. There's a forecasting panel, mostly grad students, but about 20% of them are faculty who take essentially all of the surveys posted on the platform. And so you collect forecasts, and then at the end of your study, you upload results. So most of the projects that have been posted are in applied micro, usually development economics or behavioral or experimental economics, but also some other fields within economics like labor economics, and some outside of economics entirely, like political science and psychology. Again, there's a lot of flexibility in designing your forecasting survey, so we have a wide array of ways in which people elicit these forecasts. Most often, they are eliciting just point estimates. And that's that's because I think the main way that people are using these forecasts in their research is almost, I hate to say, insurance against null results. Because if you're setting up a project and you know there's some chance in the future you'll have a null result, and you also know that it's more interesting, maybe, if you can say, yes, okay, this looks very close to zero, but you thought it would be positive. You can use those forecasts as an alternative hypothesis and test against sort of the received wisdom of experts in your area. So because of that, many of the people posting surveys really want to get through as many questions as possible. And so while I myself am a fan of getting full probability distributions, most often people will just ask for a point estimate. Here's one kind of example here. Somebody was trying to look at the impact, I think, of providing information about candidates' criminal record on votes received, so providing maybe some benchmarks, number of votes in control villages, the bottom row here as well being a benchmark of a difference in a treated village, and then asking for a couple of numbers and showing sort of how that changes, what that implies on the right-hand side sort of dynamically. So that's just one example of the kinds of questions somebody might post on the platform.
Quick question. I'm thinking here about selection effects. Sort of, I mean, what are the incentives for people to participate or run their projects through you?
For sure. So we're not going to claim that the projects are necessarily representative of the discipline as a whole. As you say, they can be selected. I will show you some summary stats later that sort of show here's the distribution of the actual treatment effects that we see, and here's some information about some benchmarks from published literatures for meta-analyses of typical effect sizes. I think the one thing that one might be most concerned about is, since I was saying people are using them almost as insurance against null results, that people might be more likely to post a project if they expect it's going to have a null result. But we don't actually see that when we look at the realized treatment effects. But we can't rule out that there's some other kind of selection here. So we're not trying to make a claim that it's representative of the whole literature. But I'll show you some summary stats later on.
Do you run the surveys on their behalf, or they run it themselves?
So the surveys are run on the platform through our own accounts. They design the surveys, but with feedback from us. So and we also record the time at which they are posting the survey relative to when they themselves have data or analyses. So in the paper, we have some robustness checks that show this was before, you posted this before you had any data, right? So you yourself can't know the result. Which is actually one of the benefits. I have to make a little plug for the platform. One of the benefits of using the platform is it is sort of like a third-party thing, so that maybe people are less suspicious of how you collected forecasts. Great, you can get the timestamps. Great. So just some summary stats. So I said that we can't sort of talk to the broader literature, but just within the studies that are posted, you can see in some columns, that first column there is all the projects posted, the 100 projects posted. The second are those that have results, okay? And you might think, okay, there's also maybe some selection in which have results by now. We don't really see that in terms of the things we can look at here. The first thing, the first row there, whether that project was posted in 2024, remember that's the end of our time period here, there are, within all projects, 26 of them had been posted in 2024. Those that have results, 15% of the 66 with results had been posted in that time period. So that's the only one that you're like, okay, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. If you're posted relatively recently, you're less likely to have results. But other than that, like number of key questions, was it an economic study? Was it in development economics, behavioral economics? Was it estimating treatment effects? You can see the different percentages there, but they look kind of comparable. Now, for some of the analyses, we're going to have to use normed treatment effects. We're going to put them all in terms of standard deviations and adjust them so they all sort of point in the same direction. A positive thing is a positive thing. And so some of them we have to reverse. So this is just on the right-hand side here. We have the norm treatment effects and the norm treatment effects with results, whether they're reversed or not. And you can also see the distribution of how the forecasts are placed on them. So Faculty forecasts represent a little bit more than a quarter of the forecasts in our sample. PhD student forecasts from students at top 10 institutions, and then forecasts from our panelists. I'll describe the panel a little bit more, but these are mostly PhD students, 20% roughly faculty. Great. So, of course, there is a lot of related literature, and including from many people in this room on the more macro side, and there's also geopolitical forecasts, of course. I think the closest to our paper is really forecasts of research results in some way, shape, or form, where there have been a number of studies that have looked, for example, at replication markets, prediction markets for does a study replicate or not, or in particular settings. I think one distinguishing feature is that we do have a very large set of projects across many different subfields, and also we have a panel, which is new. I don't believe any other effort out there has repeated forecasts from the same forecasters over time, so we can gauge forecast accuracy and ask questions about, do we see super forecasters and so on for research results specifically. Great. So what I'm going to be talking about today is I will first just sort of show you some summary stats of, okay, so what, in fact, do these treatment effects look like for the projects posted on the platform, and what did the forecasts look like? Is there any explanatory power in those forecasts at all? Then can we sort of dig a little bit deeper, and using all of the studies that have results, whether they are forecasting treatment effects or summary statistics, look at study accuracy. So look at, we're going to use the negative value of the absolute forecast error and standard deviations for our main measure here, and then ask these additional 6 questions, look at standard things like wisdom of crowds, but also what's the role of expertise, what kinds of expertise matter for forecasting research results, is there any impact of experience or learning over time, do we see some role for confidence? Some past literature suggests that maybe confidence is actually a little bit of a signal, that if you're more confident about something, maybe that does show you know something about it, but the evidence is a little bit mixed. We'll speak to that. We'll look at effort, so if you're taking longer to place your forecasts, does that seem to matter? And look at accuracy across projects, really answering the question, are there super forecasters of research results here? Great. So first things first, what's the actual distribution of realized treatment effects? So there are some benchmarks we can think of. I've done some work, and Stefano D'Alvigna and Elizabeth Linos have some work separately. I've looked at some development studies, found across a wide range of randomized controlled trials, a typical effect size of 0.12 standard deviations across all sorts of different kinds of development interventions. Stefano and Elizabeth, they found for nudge unit RCTs typical effect size of 0.05 standard deviation, so makes sense. Nudges maybe are a little bit smaller. And remember, we have a large number of both development and behavioral ones, so those are relevant for us. Here's the actual distribution in standard deviations for those that can be standardized and have resolved of all the treatment effects in our data. So this is 437 key questions here. And you can see, the mean is 0.1 standard deviations, pretty much in line. Median also, small positive number. There is a long tail, and there are some that are negative. That's how it goes, right? But this is what the real values look like. What do people forecast? Well, let's put those real results on the left-hand side, and then the forecasts are on the right-hand side here. And what you can see is there's this longer tail with even more, extreme sort of positive values here that people are predicting. The mean is even larger, and much larger actually. So there's some overestimation going on. The median is also larger. And nobody likes to forecast negative results in general. So, okay, we already get the sense that there's maybe some over-optimism here as to what research results will find. And if we sort of do this sort of individual, we subtract off the actual treatment effect from the forecasted treatment effect. You can see this for individual questions as well. Again, some overestimation going on here. Yep.
So, are you under the impression that the researchers are responding to the forecasting, perhaps like choosing the treatments they're interested in, first based off of the forecasts that look maybe the best?
Yeah, so there could be something where, so we will look a little bit later at like, do development economists predict better for development studies and things like that, which maybe gets a little bit of it at this, but you might think, if you are a researcher yourself, we'll also see this come up when we're talking about power calculations later. If you're a researcher and doing a study on something, you might be choosing that study because you're particularly interested in it, you think it's going to do really well, you're really excited about it. There could almost be like a winner's curse kind of thing going on here.
This is what I'm after.
Yeah, so that's entirely, this would be entirely consistent with that. Now, for the people who are taking the surveys, they might also, be more interested, so oftentimes if you're taking a survey, it's because somebody invited you to take that particular survey, you're an expert in that particular area. So again, that winner's curse still kind of applies to you. You really like cash transfers, so you take the cash transfer surveys, right?
I guess I don't know if you can actually do this, but if the researcher is responding to the forecast and choosing treatments that they think are going to not be null or be the biggest, this may be over-representing the over-optimism because they may be picking up like larger noise draws. You can sort of de-mean, you can de-bias the winner's curves. I don't know what it would do here.
Yeah, that's interesting. This is just looking at forecasters as a whole.
Yeah.
I will later on show some other things that are maybe, they're more speculative, but they're about the researchers themselves. But yeah, we could do we have thought a little bit about like also, some of these things in the literature where you see like, okay, we'll also ask people what they think other people will forecast, for example, and try to get some information out that way about one's own. So there's things we're thinking of, but we don't have that here. But it's a good question, yeah. So exactly, there could be a winner's curse thing here, and we could potentially take some steps about it in the future. But it's just, what do people forecast? Nonetheless, there's still some sort of explanatory power and value to these forecasts, especially if you're thinking for research design. So on the x-axis here, these are the mean forecasts of treatment effects, the bigger circles are more forecasts on that particular key question. The y-axis gives you the actual treatment effect. You see, there's some positive correlation, r squared of around 0.2 for whatever it's worth. So there's something here still. So then that sort of prompts the question, what else can we really say about forecast accuracy then to get it as good as possible? So we can look at wisdom of crowds, the role of expertise, of experience and learning over time. We can look at confidence, effort, and cross-project accuracy, like whether they're super forecasters. First of all, do we see a wisdom of crowds effect? Yes, like everybody else in the literature. The interesting thing is it doesn't require that many forecasters, actually. So the way to read this, since everything is in terms of the negative absolute forecast error, so higher values there, less negative is good, more accurate forecasts, okay? So you can see that at n of 1, you have worse quality forecasts. As soon as you even hit n of 5, you're getting these pretty good forecasts. Of course, there are improvements for n of 10 and 20 forecasters, but you're already, there are diminishing marginal returns from that, and you're already getting pretty good even with very small crowds. And what about expertise? Does it matter who's taking the survey here? Well, you do want academics to take the survey. You want PhD students, faculty to take the survey, but it doesn't matter actually between them. Faculty versus PhD students, it's all about a wash. And the interesting thing here is that, so on the left you see the absolute forecast accuracy, so the more accurate ones are those academic ones. On the right hand side you see the actual forecasts of those treatment effects. And so remember, I was telling you that overall, there's over-optimism here, but those ones are making smaller guesses, okay? So we can't say this is causal, but it sure seems to be associated with making those more accurate forecasts. Yeah?
Who are these non-academics?
So these are mostly people, I'd say, like an outside think tank. Sometimes people circulate them to their partners that they're working with, like an NGO they're working with, for example, or local government officials. We try to recommend they don't circulate them to just with the people who wouldn't really have a use for the platform normally. So suppose you're doing some study and you're like, okay, I really want to survey, teachers or firefighters or something. It's like, well, they're never going to encounter the platform again in the future. Just send the survey directly if you're going to survey them. You don't need them to go through this whole rigmarole. So, make it a little bit more targeted to them. So these are usually people who are not, they're somehow engaged with this, but non-academics, yeah. So for example, policy folks, mostly. Okay. Great question. Yep.
Couple of questions. So one thing is, this bias come from the fact that we tend to publish papers significant results compared to.
Yeah, that would completely be consistent. So you've seen a lot of, you've seen a very biased literature, and you therefore also make maybe over-optimistic forecasts. That would be consistent.
So if I am in development, faculty development, do I provide more accurate forecast for development studies? Because maybe, I tried many things, I see the papers get rejected.
I think that's the next slide. So here we show, like, if you're an economist forecasting an economic study, and if you're like a development economist forecasting development, or behavioral economist forecasting behavioral. These field experts, that's essentially discipline, subfield expert, that's development economics or whatever. And you can see actually we don't see any impact at all. Now, you could say there's still a role for expertise in a particular topic area, but it's very narrow. So, for example, within development, if I ask you to predict the impact of a program on trying to decrease child marriage in Ethiopia, you need to know Ethiopia, you need to know something about child marriage, you need to know these particular areas, So it could be that this is still too broad to pick up the role of expertise. So we don't want to say that, expertise doesn't matter, but at this level of aggregation, it does not. Okay. Then you might also think, well, people might learn something over time, and we have these panelists. And the panel, there were the 92 regular forecasters for this relevant time period. We still have a panel going on, by the way, and we're recruiting a new round of it, so if anybody's interested in joining, you can. At the time, we just had flat incentives offered. So forecast at least 80%, and you get compensated a flat amount. There were no accuracy-based incentives. Now there are, but at this time period, there were not. And yet, we still see that they have higher accuracy. Maybe by intrinsic motivation, they sort of almost self-selected into the panel. There was very limited screening just to make sure that you are a researcher and you seem responsive, you took this one intake thing. But there was very limited actual selection. So this is self-selection. And the interesting thing here is that unlike most of the slides I'll show you, where if you absolute forecast accuracy improves, that also, you see the forecasts were lower. And here you don't see that. Here you have more accurate forecasts, both more accurate sort of positively and negatively, if you see what I mean, right? Yeah. So they are actually better forecasters in that sense.
So the non-panelists are the people who are solicited to participate in the forecast?
So they're either solicited, they could also passively come across the survey if the authors chose to make it publicly available. So the authors have discretion as to how public they want it, and there's a lot of different settings. Yeah.
Because I would have imagined that because they are selected by the people doing the survey, they would know more about it.
That's true.
They would be more expert than the panelists, but I guess that's not
You
true.
would think so, but that doesn't seem to be the overwhelming thing here. Then maybe again, the people that the authors select maybe are also suffer from the same winner's curse, maybe. Okay, so then you can think, well, also these panelists, they do take many surveys over time. So is it the case that they're just learning over time and that's what makes them so good? We don't really see any evidence of that. So here we're restricting attention to those that have made at least 10 forecasts, and then just looking at those, their first 5 forecasts and 10 plus. And it basically looks very similar. Not too much going on here in terms of accuracy overall. And then interestingly, if we turn to confidence, so some of the past literature has suggested that there's a bit of signal in confidence. We actually find, unfortunately, the more confident you say you are, the worse you do. Now, most of the forecasting surveys, the authors have, we have sort of a default where we tack on some extra questions at the end of every survey. And one of those questions is just this Likert style, how confident are you in your predictions for this study overall? Okay, so that's a pretty crude measure, but still we see this huge correlation here. So that's very interesting. And I'll show you later on some multivariate regressions that include the forecaster fixed effect. And when you include the forecaster fixed effect, it seems what's going on is that there are some very confident types. And if you are a confident type, you forecast worse. If we control for your type, then sure. If you are more confident, there is still some signal there. You actually do, maybe perform a little bit better. At least the sign goes in that direction. But for this, we can see, don't trust people who are very confident. And it actually seems to be, again, they're making larger forecasts. So you're very confident and making larger forecasts.
Is this confident across many types of questions? Because there might be some information in somebody who says, well, I'm very confident in this question here, but not in others. So that cross-question confidence would be involved.
Yeah, so this is actually very similar to what I'm talking about, so if we, so this is just one survey question at the end of all the surveys, so it's about everything up to that survey, but we do see, since it is a panel, we do see people over time. And so if you are systematically across different forecasting surveys, like I'm confident about this one, I'm confident about this one, yeah. Sorry to say, there's
Isn't there some name in psychology for this effect, the Dunning?
Yes, exactly. It's very similar to the Dunning-Kruger effect.
I see it in PhD students all the time.
Do you see the characteristics of the people who say they're confident? Like, are they PhD students?
That's a good question. So we do know their attributes. I don't know what is correlated with confidence. I can show you a little bit later on a multivariate regression that controls for these different attributes that we observe, but it would also be interesting just to know who is very confident. Yeah.
It would be nice to see if it's PhD students or like,
faculty.
Senior faculty.
Yeah. We'll see.
Policy, yeah.
Okay. So just summing up where we're at so far, and then I'll go on to more results. So we do see here, this huge wisdom of crowds effect, some role for expertise, but that role is more, academic or not, rather than domains of expertise at the level that we can observe the domains. And then panelists do fairly well. If you're very high confident, you don't do quite so well. And then also, if you look at sort of the amount of time people spend, we don't really see any effect on that. And this is just the same kind of thing, but for the actual forecast. So you make smaller forecasts if you're an academic. There's that aforementioned sort of interesting thing about the panelists don't make don't make really smaller estimates, but still do better, and so on. Okay. So here's those multivariate regressions, and so you can see every other column here is controlling for the forecaster fixed effects, and all of them are controlling, I should say, for the key question fixed effects. So we're already controlling for the questions that you see for everything. So this is where, if you look at the bottom of column 1 versus column 2, that there's this, the confidence result goes away once you control for those forecaster fixed effects. And we can also look at this question of whether there are super forecasters in forecasting research results, and we do see some strong evidence of that. So on the x-axis, essentially what we're doing is we're taking all the forecasts you're making except one. The one is out of sample, so we have all these other ones that we are calculating your accuracy for. If you are high accuracy along the x-axis, you're also high accuracy for the ones left out. So that's evidence that across the different forecasts you're making, there does seem to be some super forecasters. Here's just a placebo check on that as well. We can also do some comparison to the literature. And to forecast it, we also ask people to make up what our own results would be. So the literature, those are all the triangles. Our own forecasting survey are the circles. And you can see our actual results are on the x-axis here, and the forecasted ones and the things from the literature are on the y-axis here. So that 45-degree line, the dashed line there, would be perfect accuracy, and you can see often our results fall within either the literature or what people predict, but there's a lot of variation here, and in some cases it's entirely outside of what would be forecasted, like that result on the far left is for confidence. And that was, very surprising, I think, because other work wasn't having a panel to be able to really look at this distinction between there's some super confident types. And then there's some questions, around, again, high versus low accuracy, like the super forecasters, where we only have the surveys to compare against because others haven't looked at it. Hopefully this gives a sense of the relative surprisingness of our own results. One thing that we can do now is to try to put some of the pieces together here, looking a little bit at what improves forecast accuracy, and can we do better than the forecasts that people give us by adjusting them in some ways. So first you can see the average, the typical individual forecast is the mean squared error. Now if we just take the wisdom of crowds effect, we immediately get an improvement, substantial improvement. We can also demean, subtract off the mean directional bias. That helps as well. Even a constant forecast, if you know the right constant, does better, unfortunately, than most of the forecasters. And that suggests there should really be some shrinkage going on here in the forecasts. So let's shrink the forecasts using OLS to predict one left out. Okay? And if we do that, again, great improvements here. And you don't need that many people in order for that shrinkage to work and have, to be helpful. So if you just simulate a crowd of 10 people, that's still, you can shrink it and it'll do fairly well. Okay? There's some other comparisons we can make here. Let's go back to our average forecast wisdom of the crowd. So 7 is the same as 2 here in terms of these rows. And then let's say, okay, well, we know there's some super forecasters. Why don't we weigh people in the top 50% a little bit more highly? You can do that. You can figure out how much more highly to weight them. Again, using this out of sample approach, you do a little bit better. And then you can say, well, sure, but maybe there's still some value to those others. Let's not discard the bottom 50% entirely. There's a bias variance trade-off thing going on here. Let's still use them, but put a low weight on them. Okay, you can still improve that a little bit. Let's start from yet another different vantage point. Row 5 is the same as row 10, so let's start there and compare. We started from a shrunk average forecast. Let's do the shrunk average forecast, but again, weight the top 50% more highly. And you can say, okay, well, there's also some, it's not, 50% is arbitrary. You might want to do some different cuts. Let's weight more highly the top 25% and weight less the bottom 25%, maybe actually, and it seems like the bottom 25% are not very good. So let's differentially weight them, and you still get some improvements here. So that's all to say you can do a lot better at forecasting your research results. And there's some implications of this for experimental design, as you can imagine, because if you are a researcher designing evaluation of some particular program, you need some sense of what you're going to find in order to power your study. And so what we're going to do is first we're going to infer the researcher's own forecasts. So the effect size is not something we collect, although we're adding it to the platform actually right now as I speak. We are going to sort of compare that to what they would have potentially, how they would have selected sample size and treatment arms to run if they had these optimal forecasts, quote unquote optimal. You can still do better, I'm sure. Here, we're going to just do this for the set that we can do this over, we see the study results for this set. Average treatment effect in reality was still around 0.1. Forecasted effect was still around 0.19. The actual sample size of all the treatment arms in that set on average was 2,330 individuals or whatever the sample was there. And so their actual power, implied power is 0.44. Now, if they had collected forecasts, then they would have potentially improved, they would have increased their sample size. They would know, okay, let's not just take sort of the typical forecasts out there. They would have taken these optimally weighted ones that we were just discussing previously, sort of at the very bottom of that long list. If we just use those, you'll get closer to the actual realized treatment effect. You would have powered, you would have increased your sample size. You would have ended up with something that would have been, in practice, better powered. And interestingly as well, you can say, well, look, that's fine, but I'm not going to increase my sample size that much. That's too much of a cost. So what you can do is then say, well, sure, but I'm going to choose to run some arms and not some others. In that case, here we're just going to set an artificial threshold for these two last columns where we're going to say you run it if the forecast is above 0.05 standard deviations, and below that you're like, it's never going to be powered. I'm not going to, and I also don't care about it. It's a very small treatment effect. I'm just not going to run it. So if you do that, you get a more reasonable sort of sample size that you use for still quite good power. And then there's some that you just don't run. And an interesting thing I'd like to highlight here is that actually those treatment effects that you don't run do turn out in practice to be pretty small. So, of course, this is arbitrary. You can set a different threshold, but it still shows you that there is value, real value, in fact, to collecting these forecasts and weighting them and trying to get some use out of them before you've even begun your experiment. Yeah. Okay. So, of course, there's other things that we can do. You can imagine doing this for different thresholds and decision rules. Another thing I wanted to briefly highlight is we are starting to explore the use of LLMs to do forecasts. Now, this is still early days, and the challenge is, of course, that as soon as the paper is publicly available, it could become in the training data. So what I'm showing you here is some very preliminary work looking at this very small subset that resolved in 2026, which is after the cutoff training dates for many models. We wanted to get some of the more recent models in here. I think GPT 5.6 is not here because that one cut off in February. Fable cut off in January, theoretically, though they're very cagey as to whether it's January 1st or 31st. If we try to do that for this very limited set, they do seem to perform quite well. So here, for this very limited set, are the individual forecasts. You can see the wisdom of crowd effect within this group and the shrunk average forecast within this group, very comparable to what we're getting just asking Fable, say. Okay, just showing it the same survey and without detailed prompting, although of course we've been putting some work into fine-tuning, etc. But anyways, so encouraging for the sake of improving experimental design on a larger scale without the costs of human forecasts necessarily. Great. So just summing up here. And one other thing I should actually highlight here. So we are, there is a forecasting tournament that I just want to flag that is coming up in case anybody is interested, because there's lots of forecasters in this room. that is essentially, I am extracting all of the forecasting questions for all of the studies that are posted on the AARCT registry. So all those questions, there's a funder who is putting in like $1 million of different incentives to produce, good forecasts of those. So that'll be, there should be a web page on that later this month, and then the competition will start in September if you're interested.
Can I ask you a question? How your results compare to polymarket? These are prediction markets.
Yeah.
That apparently do quite well.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, how.
Yeah. So the tricky thing is that Polymarket doesn't usually forecast research results. It'll forecast other things. Yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of the error forecast, I think that they're also the incentives.
They're also.
Different.
Yeah. So the incentives are different. So one other thing I can say, that's not in the slides, but we did look a little bit. So it's not random who is offering so we said we didn't offer incentives for accuracy during this time period, but some individual authors of studies did offer some additional accuracy-based incentives within their own surveys. And if you just look sort of qualitatively across those that offer them and those that don't, those that offer them only do about 10% better in terms of the actual accuracy. So there are some gains from those incentives, potentially. Again, that's not causal, that's just a correlation, but yeah, I think it's difficult to compare exactly against Polymarket. Actually, it makes it a little bit easier to compare when you think of the LLMs in some sense, but there are different forecasting questions, and most of them are of treatment effects rather than like a binary thing that you could score in the same way. Yeah.
I was curious about the LLM design. So you set up a bunch of agents, you mimic the platform kind of, and so there's a bunch of LLM agents doing the forecasting, and then you treat them as if they were the panelists, essentially.
Yeah. So, yes, and actually by and large, it's very difficult to do better than just giving them a pretty empty prompt, but with the forecasting survey. Like, it's very difficult to beat that, turns out, yeah. But you can still see that they actually have almost some of the same biases as the humans, maybe not surprisingly if they had a biased literature in their training data and are kind of learning the same kinds of things in some sense that humans are. They're also over-optimistic. You can still do better by shrinking their forecasts, yeah.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of like my question. So there seems to be some heterogeneity in the answers you get from the LLMs, and I was just trying to understand where they're random, obviously, so they're not going to be exactly the same. But I was just trying to understand where that heterogeneity comes, and maybe I'm not understanding the design.
Well, there's actually surprisingly not super much heterogeneity within one. So like if you use the same model and you run the same thing, you're going to get almost the same answer with a little bit of noise, tiny little bit, because it's not, but like by and large, it's like one model, one estimate pretty much. And you can do this thing where you plot the different models over time and show, yes, the models are improving in accuracy, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, you can do that, yeah.
You're basically done, right?
I am basically done, yeah.
This is not about the LLM stuff, but you had suggested that maybe researchers should choose treatment arms based off of this sort of threshold from the forecasting large enough. If they want to do power calculations afterwards, this is very much related to my first question. They should condition on, there's a way to statistically condition, give an unbiased estimate, conditional on the forecast passing a threshold. And that will affect the power calculations later. I think I'm gonna
Yeah, no, that's interesting, yeah. That's really good to know. I'm actually currently collaborating with the Open Science Framework to integrate AI forecasts into the platform, that people can also receive a forecast while they're pre-registering their project there and looking at how that affects the things that they're, so this is very relevant, yeah. Okay, summing up, key results. So first of all, there's this fairly large over-optimism bias that we observe. Nonetheless, there's still some predictive power of the forecast, which makes them amenable and useful for improving your experimental design. We do see this wisdom of crowds effect, but also we see super forecasters and this kind of interesting perverse confidence result around, almost like the Dunning-Kruger effect. Stay tuned for more stuff on LLMs and check out the social science prediction platform. Great.
Time for one question. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. This isn't the MBR group I know a lot about, and so it's really great to have some forecasts to talk about with people who know a lot about forecasting. Today I'm going to be talking about this project called Forecasting the Economic Effects of AI. It's with a large set of collaborators. I'm Ezra, I'm at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. We have, I think, 15 people involved, 20 people involved in this project, and we have a big working paper online for people who want to really dig into the weeds of all the details. But I want to just talk about some of the highlights, the motivation, the main results today. So when we think about how AI is going to affect the economy, there are these three questions that are intertwined that continue to come up in public debate. One is, how fast will AI capabilities advance? Will AI systems become capable of just independently performing these economically valuable tasks? Forecasting might be one of them, right? Maybe LLMs can replace humans at forecasting in some domains. Second, conditional on those improvements in capabilities, what happens to GDP growth, productivity, labor force participation, inequality, and other economic outcomes that economists, central banks, folks focused on fiscal and monetary policy tend to think about? And third, on the policy side, given the uncertainty about these first two questions, which policy interventions, if any, are optimal, right? Maybe none are optimal, maybe there should be policy interventions in response to AI. So when we look at public debate, it often conflates these three questions or combines them. And our goal with this project is to design a survey and implement it that separates out the answers to these three questions. So why expert forecasts? I'm really excited that we got to pair this with a paper about predicting research outcomes. In macroeconomic forecasting, we also have cases right now where there's tremendous uncertainty, maybe overconfidence about what AI is going to do to the economy. Or maybe just uncertainty that will resolve towards those overconfident results. We have industry leaders, people who are running the AI companies that are now worth trillions of dollars, who predict these really transformative effects of AI. But the current macroeconomic effects are unclear and disputed. So if we look at model-based estimates of how AI is going to affect some key outcomes like TFP, productivity, we get skeptical results. We get results from Acemoglu that, on average, he expects based on a model that AI will increase productivity by about 0.1%, 10 basis points annually. And then on the more aggressive side, you have economists who are now modeling these explosive growth pathways where AI has this transformative effect on the economy. On the labor market side, and I'm a labor economist by training, so I have read a bunch of these papers and I'm confused by them and also interested in them. We now have this back and forth between several authors about whether there are currently any effects of AI on the labor market, especially when it comes to people who are just entering the labor market or who are in very AI-exposed jobs according to various measures. And so the policy stakes here seem relatively high. Either maybe policy should react or maybe it shouldn't react, depending on whether these effects have already happened, have not already happened, or will happen in the future. So what we do is we design a large-scale expert survey. We're going to survey 5 groups of people: academic economists, people who are actually working in industry at AI companies, people who are working at think tanks focused on AI policy, super forecasters, so these are people who are accurate at forecasting on geopolitical questions in government-funded projects over the last 5 to 10 years, often funded by IARPA, and then the general public, because that's a really useful baseline case for what people are expecting about AI. We're going to get 3 types of forecasts, which I'll talk more about later on. Unconditional forecasts, just what's going to happen. Conditional forecasts under different scenarios for how AI capabilities will react, expand. And then policy forecasts and preferences. So what do people actually want to see happen when it comes to policy? And if their preferred policies are implemented, what will happen to key economic outcomes? So in terms of samples, and I'll talk about why these are so small in a second, we have 69 economists, 27 folks from AI industry, 25 people working at think tanks focused on AI, 38 super forecasters, and about 400 members of the general public. Yes?
Would you close that thing, please?
Oh, I didn't know you could see it. Thank you. Is that thing also? Don't close that. I'll move that. Okay. So let's talk about these groups. So the thing that we spent the most time on in this survey is, even though we only have 69 economists, we wanted them to be representative of a group that people care about. And so what we did is we carefully defined a sampling frame of economists by surveying the world of economists for people who've published key papers on AI and economics, people who've presented at things like the NBER conference on AI and economics. We sample from REPEC. We do age adjustments, so we don't just get a bunch of senior economists. We have people across the experience spectrum. And we also do an extra survey of people who are at top universities and just have a lot of citations. And so we end up with a sampling frame of about 1,500 economists. And we reach out to all of them and get around 69 of them to respond. The reason for that is the survey is really long, which we'll talk about in a second. On the industry side, we have this carefully defined group of folks from industry. I'll skip over these for now. AI policy, we have people from think tanks like Brookings, RAND, FAS, CSET, places that are really focused on AI, people who are focused on AI. Super forecasters, there are about 100 of them. We asked all of them to participate. We got about 38 of them. And general public, this is from Cloud Research Connect, which is like Prolific. It's a way to sample people broadly with online surveys, and I can talk more about the trade-offs there anytime. So compensation, we paid experts about $100 an hour. We paid the super forecasters around $60 an hour, and we gave members of the public around $30 or $40 as a flat fee. Let's talk a little bit about the survey. I'll actually start with the bottom point because I just mentioned compensation. The survey took about 8 hours for experts. So this is very atypical for surveys in the space. This is why the sample size is relatively small. People didn't sit down for one sitting and do the survey. It was a multi-part survey with clear sections, and people could do it over the course of several weeks. And so we actually had surprisingly low attrition once people started the survey. But we do explore other types of, did the people who complete it, do they look different from the people who attrited? And when we reweight the respondents here based on characteristics to match the sampling frame, so on observed characteristics, we don't see major differences in the reweighted versus the unweighted sample. So we actually are pretty confident, and I'd love to hear more from people about how we could convince you of this, that the responses I show you from economists are pretty representative of what economists who think about AI believe and economic growth believe. So this means that each expert, by the way, was paid about $1,000 for completing the survey, $800 to $1,000. And that also means we have some interesting bias in who responded. Like, we get more Europeans to respond than Americans. We talked to some of them. The salaries are very different, and so we think the monetary incentives did have an effect on who responded, for example. So what was actually in the survey? I mentioned these 3 different types of questions. First, unconditional forecasts. So we have this custom platform we built. We said, you're an economist, give us the median forecast of what you think is going to happen to GDP growth, and also give us prediction intervals, 10th to 90th percentile forecasts. Let's do that for both 2030 and 2050, and let's do that for key macroeconomic indicators. These are some of the ones we asked about. This is why the survey took so long. Conditional forecasts. I'm going to go into this scenario definition. We have a slow, moderate, and rapid AI capability scenario by 2030, and we ask the economists to say, in the slow scenario, what will happen to GDP growth? What will happen to inequality? What will happen to productivity? And so on. So you can see all the permutations that come out of the survey, which is both exciting and also makes the survey really long. We also ask about policy forecasts. So we took 6 policies from the literature, ranging from universal basic income to a tax on compute, and we said, if these policies are implemented in a cost-neutral way, what would happen to GDP growth and what would happen to the labor force participation rate? So let's talk a little bit about the scenarios which are core to this project. And I want to say we describe these as slow, moderate, and rapid. It was very hard to come up with titles that were value neutral for what these scenarios actually mean. Slow is still pretty impressive. Moderate is very fast in some ways. And rapid is maybe more like what people in industry are talking about when they think about more explosive economic growth. So let's separate these out. The slow progress scenario is what all of you in this room are using AI for now, but a bit better. So you can do a good literature review with AI systems. It can solve, 4 to 8 hour software engineering tasks that you would otherwise have someone do or do yourself if you're a programmer. It can make passable songs and stories if you just prompt it to produce a song or a story. And it can do small administrative tasks and, medium to short robotics tasks. The moderate scenario is pretty advanced. It can do software engineering jobs that would take about a week for a typical human who's very good at this. We have semi-autonomous research labs that can just improve on things like how solar cells are working. So you can do some scientific R&D directly from AI systems. If you prompt an AI system in this moderate scenario, it will produce a pretty good novel, and you can read it. It will produce a hit song. It will be able to do a complex project with a lot of oversight. And from a robotics perspective, and I know this capability is kind of different from the other ones, we're imagining, we have robo-taxis and we have AI-based systems that can do basic household tasks like run a dishwasher or other things. The rapid scenario is very rapid relative to what this group might be thinking about. So you can do years of work in days when it comes to research. You can imagine this as like the papers presented today an AI system could just produce. From a problem-solving perspective, it can outperform virtually all humans on non-physical tasks like clerking or being a paralegal or software engineer, tasks that those occupations would generally, it would take them a week or two, it can just do. On the creativity side, you can prompt an AI system and it will produce a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, and that's relative to today's standards, right? So quality might just go up, but it's not hard for these AI systems to do that in this scenario. Grammy caliber songs. It can do CEO level operations. So you can imagine an AI system just being in a C-suite of a company. And it can do most robotic and industrial tasks that can't currently happen today just with a snap of a finger. So this is a very advanced scenario. Now I want to stop here to say, when I present this paper to academic economists, they think this is ridiculous, and they think the moderate scenario is a bit of a stretch, but we might get there in 5 to 50 years. When I present this work at OpenAI or Anthropic, they're like, we are definitely going to get here in a couple years. Why are you focusing on these slow and moderate scenarios? So I think in some ways, these three scenarios are really nice because they differentiate the debate that's currently happening in public between experts who have thought a lot about economic growth and people who are actually working on the technology. And that means we can separate out beliefs about which of these scenarios we're in 5 years from beliefs about what will happen to the economy in a case where we are in that scenario. And I think that's pretty valuable. Yes?
To this point, given that these things are kind of, at least this one definitely is exponential, and we know we struggle with exponential, like did you play around with the horizon at which, because again, that matters a lot, where this thing is supposed to happen. In 2030, for this kind of thing, I feel is maybe close-ish, but 2050 not at all, right? So
yes. So in this survey, we did not play around with the timing. I have another project called the Longitudinal Expert AI Panel, which is a monthly survey of AI experts that we're running for 3 years, which has 200 experts who answer 5 questions a month about AI. And there we've asked questions about timelines related to this and other projects. And so if you look up, it's called LEAP, you can see forecasts of those things. But in this project, we couldn't permute more or else we would have had a riot. So we just focused on the 2030 scenarios. And I think in general, what you'll see is that even though this might be the start of an exponential where people aren't sure where it's going, this is going to differentiate beliefs enough to be really interesting. So if I'd asked about 2040, it might be even more interesting. We might see bigger fanning out of the economic outcomes, but this was good enough, I think, for now. Yes?
Did you ask participants how much weight they gave to the different scenarios?
Yes.
Does that give an indication how much
Absolutely. That's coming right up. That's a key question. So I'll get to that right now. Most respondents expect substantial AI progress by 2030. I'll show you a graph in a second. But the mean probability that is assigned to the moderate or rapid scenario by 2030 was 61% for economists, 61% for experts, 60% for the general public, 55% for super forecasters. So this is across moderate plus rapid. I'll show you the distribution in a second. The mean probability that economists placed on rapid was around 14%. Now, I want to take a step back and say, how do we ask this question? I like asking questions in a properly incentivized way. And so I didn't say just, what do you believe? Throw a number out of a hat. What I said is, tell us what you think this similar panel of experts will say is the scenario we're in 2030. So they're forecasting what the panel is going to say in 2030 when I re-ask this question in 4 years. Just to explain to you how we're grounding the scenario question. Yes?
Did you elicit their confidence? Because, you know, I can have a point estimate, but...
On many of the outcomes we elicited the confidence. On this, we did not. So I think I should elicit either a Likert scale-based confidence or some sort of distribution at some point. And we're going to resurvey these people soon, so that would be a fun follow-up. Okay, this is the histogram. So 4 groups on the rows, slow, moderate, and rapid are the columns. And what you can see is the interquartile ranges are really big, right, across the respondents for each of the groups. So just focusing on the economists, which is, the bottom group, which is harder to see for people in the back maybe, we see an interquartile range of weight placed on the slow scenario of 17 to 60%. Moderate is 32 to 65, rapid is 7 to 20. So experts are quite confident that the rapid scenario, it's not 50% likely to occur, according to this group of experts. Moderate and slow, they're really unsure about. Yes?
Just for me to understand better, why is there this like bimodal type distribution?
Yeah.
Do we have an understanding of why they kind of separate out like that, or?
I'm seeing this in a bunch of our projects about AI forecasting. I think we do have 2 different schools of thought. One who thinks that AI companies are crazy and skeptical and think it's a bubble, and then one who thinks that this is a real thing and it's going to matter a lot. So I think the bimodality is real in a bunch of questions we've asked. It depends on the sample and it depends on the question. Yeah?
So you previously highlighted the difference between AI experts and economists, but looking at this, I actually think there's a more stark comparison with super forecasters who maybe are, trained in some sense on nothing ever happens.
Yes. Yes, I think that's definitely happening. I also actually find the comparison to the public maybe one of the most interesting, and I'll talk about that more for some of the outcomes. You don't see that as much in this graph, but you will in some of the outcome graphs. What I would say is economists and experts are going to look very similar, and AI experts are going to look very similar across the study. I'm mainly just going to talk about economists because the other groups are so similar in some ways. What I find most interesting, and we talk about this in the working paper a bit, is the AI experts, the people who are actually working at the AI companies, do have very different responses on average than the leaders of the AI companies. So if you think about what the CEOs of the key frontier AI companies are saying, those forecasts are just clearly differentiable from these forecasts from the people who are working at the companies. And I find that fascinating.
So just to be clear, the leaders of the companies are the ones that say rapid is happening for sure.
Yes.
The experts are just like the rest of the economists.
Yes, that's exactly right. Now you might think, we've had this concern expressed in seminars before. Who's responding to an 8-hour survey? It's the people who don't think AI is going to come and change the economy a lot. Those people are busy, at the companies working very hard. I don't think that's exactly happening, but I think there may be a bit of that as well. We do some work on projects where we're forecasting these catastrophic events, low probability events, existential risk. And one thing people who work on reducing the odds of an existential risk tell us is that they don't really want to spend time talking to us because they're worried about trying to reduce the odds of an existential catastrophe. So I think the opposite might be happening here. Okay, GDP forecasts. So I'm going to present several graphs like this, so I'll spend the most time on this version of the graph. The black line is historical data. We provided this to all participants. Yes?
On the previous comment,
yes.
Do you worry at all about using AI to respond to your survey?
No. So we have done a lot of surveys, and what's nice is so this is work with the Forecasting Research Institute, which is a nonprofit we set up that has been doing work since about a year before LLMs became a big deal, so maybe starting in 2021. And so I can actually compare response quality and types of responses and how Pangram looks when I give it confidential data from our rationales across that area. We see some experts using AI for rationales. It's a minority of people. When you get rid of those estimates, you get very similar aggregate forecasts. And I also, when I produce forecasts, I like participating in forecasting surveys. I always check what an LLM would say if I'm allowed to, and so I'm not sure that's a bad thing. It's still maybe a reflection of their beliefs. Okay, GDP. The black line is historical data. Recently, it's averaged around 2.4% annually. What I'm going to show you is a series of fanned out lines The gray line is the unconditional forecast, and then blue, purple, and red reflect forecasts under the slow, moderate, and rapid scenarios. And the prediction intervals are these red, the red, shading shows the prediction interval, the median 10th to 90th percentile from experts about what will happen to GDP growth under the rapid scenario. And under it, and much smaller and lower, is the gray prediction interval about the unconditional results. And so I'll just point out some points on the graph so that we can talk about what they mean. Unconditionally, economists think that last year of data is just going to continue, right? Their median forecast of GDP growth is 2.5%. That's the gray box. So that's here and here. Under the rapid scenario, their median forecast is the red boxes. It's 3.3 percentage points annually in the years leading up to 2030 and 3.5 percentage points annually in the years leading up to 2050. I get a similar response to the scenario forecast when I present this in different audiences. So when I present this at government agencies, that's incredibly large relative to the predictions from central banks and other government agencies about what will happen to economic growth. When I present this at AI labs, they think it's ridiculously small relative to what they expect to happen to the economy. So I find that distinction really interesting. The AI experts do project under a rapid scenario larger numbers. Super forecasters are maybe in between. The public is surprisingly similar in this graph to the other groups. And I want to point out maybe two generally interesting facts here, right? You might think of some shocks as causing a one-time increase in economic output, which doesn't affect the growth rates for very long. That's not what any group is expecting here. They're expecting that AI will lead to increases in annual growth that then will accumulate over time. Second is just the uncertainty, right? These bands, which reflect the median 10th to 90th percentile forecasts from the groups, because we did get confidence in all of these outcome questions, they're tremendously wide. Under the rapid scenario, they range from 1% up to 7%. That's a huge difference in annual growth rates that would compound, where experts just are not sure what's going to happen. And what I find most interesting is that those prediction intervals are much bigger under the rapid scenario than they are unconditionally. And so if you think about the unconditional forecast, and I'll say this, and I'll show this in a little bit, as being a combination, an integration up of the scenario forecasts times these distributional forecasts, what that means is under a slower moderate scenario, the point estimate would be lower and experts would be much more certain about what would happen. It's the rapid scenario that's causing a lot of uncertainty in the forecasts. Does that make sense? Yes?
That's a question about comparing the three left, experts, economists, super forecasters, and random person from the street.
Yeah.
The fact that their forecasts are so similar,
yeah.
Is that telling us something about these responses are not based on specialist knowledge?
Good question. So one thing that might be happening is the public respondents to this survey had to unobservably be willing to spend a lot of time sitting down and taking a survey. Most people on the street might not have. Second, we're giving them baseline information. That was on purpose, but we know it might anchor people. And so it's easier to pull dots up and down relative to a baseline and say rapid is higher, moderate's lower, slow is really low. But I was very surprised at how similar these were. In this other project, the Longitudinal Expert AI Panel, we see that the public is much less, they think AI is less of a big deal than the experts. So they predict smaller changes on most outcomes than experts. It's not a big difference, but it's there. Yes?
So there's very little downside. I mean, you mentioned about, people who would foresee this Armageddon choosing not to be in the survey, but at the same time, I mean, you can write down models, I guess. There's more spreadable macro models in which there's wealth concentration as a result of AI that means that overall growth might go down.
Yes.
So you don't see that in the survey, huh?
No. Point estimates are not that, and I'll show you inequality in a few slides.
Yeah, and do you have a sense, I mean, do you ask specifically about, people's probability of a growth slowdown as a result of AI?
So they can give us, so we collect detailed rationales for each question, and so I can look to see if that was the case, but I didn't specifically separate out the mechanisms and ask them about the likelihood of each one being key. I think that would be very interesting. Yes?
Probably related to Andrew and Alan's question. Do you think that super forecasters, AI experts, maybe less, and economists actually subconsciously use like a insanity filter? Right? They go, maybe it's 3.5,
Great.
but it's never going to be 10%.
Yep. That's the belief of people at the labs. They think that basically economists are bad at visualizing out of distribution outcomes. And I can see that, right? That's a model of the world that's very interesting to me. I have been working, we have a computer science paper out now that we've been constructing benchmarks of how good AI systems and humans are at forecasting. We have one called Forecast Bench that a lot of companies submit to. We have another one we're doing, which I'm very excited about, which involves forecasting the results of video games and simulations. And what's nice about that is I can shock the system in various ways. And so I'm starting to gather evidence on how well large language models and also soon humans can do at forecasting maybe more extreme outcomes in cases where we can even tell people they might happen, right? But I want to see how much that insanity defense is happening. Yes?
In the more optimistic scenario that you present, how do you compare that to singularity?
Great.
That's a bit related to the question that Alan was asking.
So I'm going to work very hard to not say optimistic, because I've gotten some feedback that we don't want to put values on these scenarios. They might be good or bad. But in the really rapid scenario, or the scenario with larger economic growth, I think what's nice is I'm forcing people to quantify their beliefs here. When people talk about the singularity, they tend to not tell me whether it's 10% GDP growth or 5% or 3.6% or infinite. And so I don't really know how to compare these results to people who say that the singularity is coming unless they're also quantifying what that means. But I think there were forecasters in our study who do have larger effects. These are kind of aggregated, right? And those forecasters did sometimes mention singularity-like outcomes in their rationales. Okay, so because I work at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, I like to just present these estimates relative to what government agencies are saying. And you can see that these estimates are higher than all other private and government estimates of GDP growth, except for under President Trump's Office of Management and Budget, which produces forecasts, and OMB forecasts move around a lot depending on like political considerations in ways that might be less representative or useful for government agencies. But the Congressional Budget Office, Goldman Sachs, the Federal Reserve, these groups are all projecting GDP growth in the US of closer to 2% or 1.9% in the next 5 years. That's well below the unconditional forecasts from this survey of economists. And in the long run, there's a belief that growth in the US is going to slow down. The two estimates we have from CBO and the OECD project growth of around 1.5%. We're estimating from this set of experts, growth closer to 2.5% unconditionally. And so there are now several think tanks that have come out and said, well, if the estimates from our paper are true, then that means that has very important implications for debt, tax policy, and other things, because economic growth is one way that you can address debt, for example. Yes?
The CFO survey had a special collection on AI.
Oh, great. I'll look that up. No. Yes?
How does these projections compare to GDP growth in the U.S. after, say, the second industrial revolution?
Great. This, like a growth rate of 3.54%, we're talking maybe post-World War II boom. I actually don't know what the U.S.'s economic growth, and I don't know how well we can measure it back during the Industrial Revolution. It's an interesting question. Yeah. But to put it in perspective, like the last 30 years, much slower than 3.5%. Post-World War II boom, this is more similar to. So this is not out of distribution relative to what the U.S. has seen over the past century, but it would be out of distribution relative to the last 30 or 40 years.
There are estimates of the first industrial revolution that put at around 6% per year during the first decade of growth.
But that's in Europe. I thought the question was about the U.S. But yeah, I think the European example post-industrial revolution is really interesting. Yes?
I mean, on your GDP forecast, you're giving people a lot of time to answer this survey.
Yes.
But, for example, the OMB or the CBO, they're taking months to produce these long-range forecasts, building up
Yes.
supply side. So, I mean, if you ask me how they got to 2.5, it looks a lot like that's a random walk extrapolation of the 2.5 growth that we've seen over the past year.
Great. I think it is possible that that's the data generating process they're using to get these results, but I want to push back on two things. One is, when you say random walk, you might say these are low effort. I think the fanning out of the scenario conditional forecasts imply that they're actually thinking about what the scenarios would do, at least directionally and probably in magnitude. And second, random walk might be a good model of GDP growth unconditionally. So that doesn't seem shocking to me. Yeah. We have some unpublished work where we've just randomly given regular people the anchors or not, and it increases accuracy when we've done it so far, and so I was less worried about anchoring just leading to a bad random walk forecast than I might have otherwise been. Okay, I'm going to skip over the rationales, but we have hundreds of thousands of words of explanations that we're analyzing, and we have some of that in the paper if you want to read more. I now want to talk about labor force participation rates. This is inverted, but has the same fanning out structure. And so what you can see is that unconditionally, there's this belief that demographics are just going to cause the U.S. to, slow its labor force participation rate. It's going to decline a bit by maybe a few percentage points from its current level of around 62.6%. Under a rapid scenario, there's a projection that by 2050, labor force participation rates at median forecasts would be, an extra 3 percentage points lower, according to economists, relative to what they would expect under a slow or unconditional scenario. So this is a big effect. It's maybe on the order of 5 to 10 million jobs, depending on what you're thinking about as the base there. And you can also see that the prediction intervals here are even more stark, just in economic magnitudes and how important it would be for the economy. What we see here is that the 80% prediction interval spans around 45 percentage points, which would be a just regime change in how labor in the U.S. worked, up to maybe what it is now, like 61%.
Did you look at the heuristic? I mean, who's going to consume all of this output growth?
Great. I'll get to inequality in a second. That at least partially answers the question. Just to briefly talk about uncertainty, if you bootstrap and pool from these distributions, the gray distribution here is the unconditional labor force participation rate forecasts for each group in 2030 on the left and 2050 on the right. The red is under the rapid scenario, so you can just see the shift to the left of the distribution and the widening of the distribution of forecasts. Wealth inequality. So people think that under a rapid scenario, there'll be a large increase in wealth inequality. In the paper, I won't talk about this today, we have also median household income, happiness, other measures of welfare, and there's a projection that those will also benefit, but wealth inequality is really projected to spike under a rapid scenario, according to all groups. Okay, so what's driving disagreement? I think that's a key reason we started this project. There's uncertainty and disagreement about two key pieces that I want to disentangle to start before we get to policies. One is AI capabilities, and the second is economic effects given capabilities. And there's some discussion by Tom Cunningham, who's a wonderful economist, that says disagreement is really about the first. It's about disagreement about capabilities. We can look at that 2x2 matrix and say, well, within forecaster and within scenario, there's just generic uncertainty about what's going to happen in the economy. Within forecasters and between scenarios, people have uncertainty about which scenario is occurring. And then on the bottom left, we have actual disagreement between forecasters within a scenario about what will happen to economic outcomes. And then on the bottom right, we have disagreement about capabilities. It's the between forecaster, between scenario disagreement. So let's do that decomposition with, we did get full distributions in some way, which is nice. We do have to do some fitting and some smoothing and so on. But what we see is that the vast majority of variation is just coming from within scenario, within forecaster. That's the dark green at the bottom. And so what that means is that people are just very uncertain about these outcomes, right? No matter which scenario we're in, which person you're talking to, they're going to put a wide interval, prediction interval, on what's going to happen to GDP growth or inequality or labor force participation. But we can look at the other part of the variation, and we can see that among the between forecaster disagreements, the within scenario component is more important than the between scenario capabilities component for almost every outcome. This is true for, I think, all but one of our outcomes very clearly. And so what does that mean? Well, let's fan this out. I forget if this is called a Sankey plot, but let's fan this out and let's talk about the total variation of 100%. And let's divide it into the within scenario and between scenario variation. And most of the variation is coming from within a scenario. And let's divide that further between within forecaster and between forecaster variation. And we can see that within forecaster variation is important. And then let's separate out the rapid scenario from the slow and moderate scenario. And what we can see is that while it is true that under the rapid scenario, as I showed you in those fanning out plots, there's a lot more uncertainty, bigger standard deviations about what will happen with GDP growth. Most of the overall variation in this exercise is coming from just within scenario variation and uncertainty. So we go into more detail about this with some examples in the paper. I will just jump directly to the last section, which is policy responses. So there are 6 policy proposals that we decided to investigate in this paper. They range from a worker retraining program to modernize unemployment insurance system, universal basic income, large-scale government investment in AI, which we call the Manhattan Project for AI, as several think tanks have called it, a tax on compute, which people have proposed if they want to slow down AI or subsidize labor if capital ends up being more important, and then a federal jobs guarantee. We developed this list of policies a year or two ago, and so we're not saying this is comprehensive, but we think comparing them is useful. We make sure that when we ask for forecasts about these policies, we say that these are all funded cost neutrally. So we have a tax that offsets the costs of each of these policies. So forecasts that you see are not because we are spending a bunch of money that's being raised in debt in this counterfactual. Now, which policies do people like? Let's compare economists to the general public. Everyone loves worker retraining and a modernized unemployment insurance system. I should also say that we have yes, we had uncertain, and we have no, right? So yes being 70% implies a lot of support. Economists are not at all fans of universal basic income. The public likes it relatively more. But what the economists really don't like is a federal jobs guarantee, which the public is broadly supportive of. And so we can see that local policies are ones that both economists and the public like. Broader policies are ones that economists are more skeptical about, but the public also tends to like. What effect would these have on GDP growth and labor force participation rates? This was the last section of our survey. And here, we ask in the gray bar about what would happen under unconditional, just overall. And in the red bar, we ask specifically about what would happen under a rapid scenario if this policy was implemented. The results don't differ that much. And what you'll see is that modernizing the unemployment insurance system, no one thinks will have an effect on either economic growth or on the labor force participation rate. But a job retraining program, economists actually believe would have a positive effect of around 0.1 percentage points annually in growth terms on GDP growth, and it would also, they think, increase the labor force participation rate by a couple of percentage points, although less in the rapid scenario. And so this is an interesting example, I think, of where you can do causal policy forecasts. And as you saw in the last paper, should we trust forecasts of treatment effects? There's some predictability there. I don't know if we should trust long-run, really complicated forecasts about policies that haven't happened before, but that's another really interesting open research question. If we do think these forecasts have some meaning, then the fact that some policies are clearly projected to affect the outcomes that people care about as policymakers is interesting.
The retraining in this scenario doesn't make sense because in 2050 we are going to be in singularity. So what are you going to be ready for?
Well, if you were in the survey, you would be a dot that wasn't represented by the median. So, there are forecasts all over the place here. These are medians. So I think your response would probably be consistent with saying it wouldn't have any effect. You also don't think it would have a negative effect, I'm guessing. I think there's always a problem with surveys like this with more extreme potential outcomes where you have to really get people to internalize that, but then their forecast has to make sense. So if you think a singularity is coming, I think we actually had a note in our survey about economic growth to just cap your GDP forecast at 100 percentage points annually so that you didn't go off the graph completely. And we'll just deal with that later. But there's a reason I'm reporting medians here. Mainly so I don't have to deal with people like you. Okay, conclusion. Experts expect substantial AI capability progress, but most of the unconditional outcomes are consistent with historical experience, even if it's not the last few years. Conditional in a rapid scenario, there are expectations that there'll be significant shifts, but not transformative acceleration when it comes to GDP growth, labor force participation rate, and inequality by 2050 and by 2030. This is similar to maybe post-World War II economic growth, labor force participation rate for maybe before women were often allowed to or were in the labor force in high rates, and maybe pre-World War II levels of inequality. But the main source of disagreement is about economic effects given the capability levels, not the pace of AI capabilities themselves in the way we structure the scenarios. So we think a key takeaway here is that researchers and policymakers should consider the distribution of possible outcomes and uncertainty, not just as most likely path, to disagree with my median point. Like, we think it's important that they take into account the fact that there's this uncertainty about potentially explosive growth or large negative effects on labor force participation rates, because the tail outcomes that experts are predicting under these rapid scenario estimates are pretty large. And my last point would be, on the policy side, economists and the public, maybe more than I expected, agree on and broadly support a set of policies, even though there is sharp divergence on another set of policies. Yes?
I wanted to ask you a question for big picture. Typically, we trust the experts a bit more than, let's say, non-experts, but in this case, there could be strategic reasons, no? Some strategic incentives to...
So tell me what the strategic incentives would be.
No, I'm saying, like, if I work for a forecast, I mean, for an AI company or a...
Yeah.
Right, who are those experts? Like, the leaders definitely have an incentive
Agreed. To raise money.
It's gonna change
Yeah,
the-
valuations,
to raise
yeah.
money, exactly. But I also could have, I don't know, some bias in the fact that I would,
I don't know. I think.
I mean, I'm just asking.
Great.
like,
So
should I-
let me respond to that in a couple ways. First of all, we always report medians in our papers that we work on. You can't really affect the median much by increasing your forecast relative to what you expected if you know you're part of a group of 100 people. Also, our IRB says you're going to be anonymous. We're never going to report your name. Like, it's hard for me to think that you would have a reputational reason to have your own forecast linked to you and then bias it in a certain way. But another point that was somewhat reassuring to me, it's not like we have 4 groups of people with very different forecasts here. They all kind of imply the same conclusions broadly. So whether you want to rely on what the experts say, what the highly accurate forecasters say, or what the general public says, you're seeing pretty similar estimates that I think have these implications about uncertainty, policy effects, point estimates, and confidence intervals that are pretty consistent across groups in most cases. And so I find that somewhat reassuring. Back in 2022, we ran this big survey called the Existential Risk Persuasion Tournament, where we had experts and super forecasters and members of the general public forecast on about 50 questions. The average person only did 15 or 20 questions they could select about what would happen with nuclear weapons and climate change and AI and various other like key, bioweapon use, key questions about the economy and the world. And these were questions not only about risk, but also about, scientific progress. And it's now been 3 or 4 years, and so we just did the first wave of resolutions on the questions that we now know the answer to, because some of the questions were resolved in 2025. And what we saw is that experts and super forecasters were significantly more accurate than the public at median when forecasting on these questions, and that experts and super forecasters did not differ that much in terms of accuracy. And so I think I combine that work that we have a paper online about with this work, and I say, if you're going to trust a group, I probably wouldn't trust the public from an accuracy perspective. I would trust experts and super forecasters, and they agree, so there's not much to disentangle there. And then if you want to trust them versus AI lab leaders, I think there's this reputational point that you made. But I don't know who's going to be right, and that's why we're still doing research in the space. Yes?
I think you mentioned you're still have the ability to ask more questions in a future round. I would, add a +1 to adding some information on uncertainty.
Yes.
Because, you might think that some people faced with a lot of uncertainty might also have a tendency to shade their response downwards a little bit. Also it would, I'm also curious about it because of what we find about the overconfidence thing.
Yeah, I loved your
Where it did
overconfidence
track
results.
Where it
Yeah.
did track the also means that people were given.
Yeah, it gave me an idea too, which is I think we should ask that question, and then also we have enough written commentary on the forecast from the participants that I'm wondering if we can just understand who's overconfident from looking at the rationales.
Some of that with LMs, I think.
Yeah, and we have this paper, and I want to let everyone get to lunch, but we have this paper that says if you look at people's written explanations for their forecasts, you can actually predict about half of the variation in accuracy at the forecaster level just from key features of what they said. Like, were they using facts? Were they aligning their forecast with their rationale? And that's all coded up with LLMs. So I should definitely take that and what you're talking about with overconfidence and then apply it here. Thank you so much. I'll stick around if anyone has questions. Thank you. Thank you for your questions.
So 3.5%